Chapter 12. The Nautilus Unveiled. A haze of cigar smoke hung in the air as we settled onto a plush divan in the saloon. Captain Nemo unfurled a detailed sketch before me, revealing the Nautilus' inner workings. "Professor Aronnax," he began, his voice a low rumble, "allow me to elucidate the dimensions of your current abode. It is, in essence, an elongated cylinder with tapered ends, reminiscent of a fine cigar, a design not entirely unfamiliar in London's shipbuilding circles." He traced a finger along the diagram. From bow to stern, the Nautilus measures precisely 232 feet, with a maximum breadth of 26 feet. While not conforming to the design of your conventional steamers, her sleek lines and extended curves facilitate the effortless passage through water. These dimensions, with simple calculation, reveal the Nautilus' surface area to be 6,032 square feet, and her volume approximately 1,500 cubic yards. Fully submerged, she displaces 50,000 cubic feet of water, equivalent to 1,500 tons. Nemo paused, his eyes gleaming with a feverish intensity. In conceiving this vessel, I envisioned 9/10 of her bulk submerged, thus displacing only 9/10 of her weight. To achieve this, I meticulously calculated the precise weight for her dimensions, ensuring she wouldn't exceed the necessary displacement. He tapped the diagram, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. The Nautilus comprises two hulls, one nested within the other, interconnected by T-shaped iron beams fortifying her structure. This cellular design grants her the resilience of a solid block, impervious to the most tumultuous seas. Both hulls, he continued, are forged from steel plates with a density 70 to 80% that of water. The inner hull, a formidable 2.5 inches thick, weighs 394 tons. The outer hull, forming the keel, stands 20 inches high with a thickness of 10 inches, adding another 62 tons. The engine, ballast, various instruments, bulkheads, and other components collectively weigh 961.62 tons. "Are you following, Professor?" I nodded, captivated by his meticulous explanation. "Therefore," Nemo concluded, "when afloat, 1/10 of the Nautilus remains above the surface. By filling reservoirs in the lower hull, each capable of holding 150 tons of water, she can be fully submerged, reaching a total weight of 1,507 tons. Intrigued, I ventured a question. "Captain, while I comprehend the ascent, I am perplexed by the descent. Surely at greater depths, the immense pressure would exert an upward force, impeding your submersion." Nemo's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Professor, one must not conflate statics with dynamics, lest one fall prey to grave misconceptions. Descending to the ocean's depths requires minimal effort, for all objects naturally gravitate downwards. To determine the necessary weight increase for submerging the Nautilus, I merely calculated the reduction in seawater volume as depth increases." The implications of his words hung heavy in the air, a silent testament to the ingenuity of the Nautilus and her enigmatic captain. Now, while water isn't entirely incompressible, it does compress slightly under pressure. According to the latest calculations, this reduction is a mere 0.000436 of an atmosphere for every 30 feet of depth. To reach a depth of 3,000 feet, we need only account for the volume reduction under the pressure of a 1,000-foot column of water. The calculation is straightforward. With supplementary reservoirs capable of holding 100 tons, we can descend to considerable depths. To ascend, we simply release water from the reservoirs, emptying them completely if we wish the Nautilus to surface entirely. I found his logic unassailable. "I concede your calculations, Captain," I replied. "They are borne out by daily experience. However, I foresee a potential obstacle." "And what might that be, Professor?" "At a depth of 1,000 feet, Nautilus hull would endure a pressure of 100 atmospheres. If you were to empty the supplementary reservoirs to ascend, your pumps would need to overcome this immense pressure, 1,500 pounds per square inch. That would demand extraordinary power, a power only electricity can provide, Nemo interjected. I assure you, Professor, the dynamic force of my engines is virtually limitless. The Nautilus pumps possess immense power, as you witnessed when their torrents of water engulfed the Abraham Lincoln. Moreover, I utilized the subsidiary reservoirs only to reach depths between 750 and 1,000 fathoms, primarily for maneuvering. When I intend to explore the ocean's abyssal depths, miles below the surface, I employ alternative methods, slower but equally reliable. And what methods are those, Captain? That, Professor, involves revealing the Nautilus' inner workings. I am eager to learn. To steer the Nautilus horizontally, starboard, port or turning, I employ a conventional rudder affixed to the stern post, controlled by a wheel and tackle. However, I can also control her vertical movement, ascent and descent, using two inclined planes on her sides, opposite the center of buoyancy. These planes, operated by powerful interior levers, can be angled in any direction. When parallel to the hull, the Nautilus moves horizontally. When angled, she either ascends or descends diagonally, depending on the inclination and the propeller's thrust. For a rapid ascent, I simply retract the propeller, allowing the water pressure to propel the Nautilus upwards like a hydrogen-filled balloon. Remarkable, Captain. But how does the helmsman navigate beneath the waves? He is housed in a glazed observation chamber atop the Nautilus, equipped with lenses. Can these lenses withstand such immense pressure? Absolutely. Glass, while fragile to impact, possesses surprising resilience under pressure. During our 1864 experiments with electric fishing lights in the Arctic, we observed glass plates less than 1/3 of an inch thick withstand pressures of 16 atmospheres. The glass I employ is at least 30 times thicker. I see, but to see, there must be light, and in the ocean's darkness, how do you achieve this? Behind the helmsman's chamber resides a powerful electric reflector, illuminating the sea for half a mile ahead. Ah, so that explains the phosphorescence we observed from the supposed narwhal. Now, I must inquire, Captain, was the encounter between the Nautilus and the Scotia, which caused such a stir, merely a chance meeting? Purely accidental, Professor. I was cruising a mere fathom below the surface when the impact occurred. Thankfully, there were no adverse consequences. Indeed, Captain. But what of your encounter with the Abraham Lincoln? A shadow passed over Nemo's face. Professor, I lament the damage inflicted upon one of America's finest vessels. However, they initiated the attack, forcing me to defend myself. I merely disabled the frigate. She should be easily repaired at the nearest port. Ah, Captain, your Nautilus is truly a marvel of engineering. Nemo's eyes softened, his voice tinged with affection. Yes, Professor, and I cherish her as an extension of myself. While those aboard surface vessels may feel a sense of dread at the vastness of the ocean, the Nautilus inspires unwavering confidence in her crew. There are no weaknesses to fear, for her double hull is as resilient as iron. No rigging to maintain, no sails to be torn by the wind, no boilers to rupture, no fire to dread, as she is forged from iron, not wood. No coal shortages to worry about, for electricity is her sole power source. No risk of collision, for she navigates the uncharted depths. No storms to weather, for beneath the waves she finds absolute tranquility. There, Professor, lies the epitome of maritime perfection. And if it's true that the engineer trusts the vessel more than the builder, and the builder more than the captain, you can understand the unwavering faith I place in my Nautilus. For I'm at once captain, builder, and engineer. My curiosity piqued, I inquired. But how did you construct this extraordinary vessel in secrecy? Each component, Professor Aronnax, was sourced from a different corner of the globe. The keel was forged in Crusoe. the propeller shaft at Penn and Company in London, the hull's iron plates at Laird's of Liverpool, the propeller itself at Scott's in Glasgow. The reservoirs were crafted by Kyle and Company in Paris, the engine by Krupp in Prussia, the ram in Motala's workshop in Sweden, the mathematical instruments by Hart Brothers of New York, and so on. Each supplier received my orders under various aliases, but these disparate parts had to be assembled and integrated. Indeed, Professor, I established my workshops on a remote, uninhabited island. There, my dedicated crew, men I personally trained and educated, worked alongside me to construct the Nautilus. Upon completion, we erased all traces of our activities, reducing the island to ashes. Had I wished, I could have easily leapt over the flames. The cost of such a vessel must have been astronomical. An iron vessel, M. Aronnax, typically costs around $24,000 per ton. The Nautilus, weighing 1,500 tons, thus amounted to $36 million. An additional $12 million was spent on outfitting, and roughly $30 million more on the artwork and collections she houses. Before our conversation concluded, I posed one final question. Captain Nemo, you are a man of immense wealth, are you not? Immensely wealthy, Professor. I could effortlessly settle France's national debt without feeling the pinch. I gazed at this enigmatic figure, pondering his words. Was he merely testing the limits of my credulity? Only time would reveal the truth. Chapter 13, Into the Black River. The Earth's surface is dominated by water, a vast expanse covering over 80 million acres. This immense liquid mass, a staggering 2.25 billion cubic miles, forms a sphere 60 leagues in diameter, weighing an unimaginable 3 quintillions of tons, a number so vast that it dwarfs even billions. To grasp the enormity of this figure, consider that a quintillion is to a billion what a billion is to one. This colossal volume of water is equivalent to the combined discharge of all Earth's rivers over 40,000 years. In the Earth's tumultuous geological past, the fiery igneous period followed the watery aqueous age. Initially, the ocean reigned supreme, blanketing the entire planet. Gradually, during the Silurian period, mountain peaks pierced the surface. Islands emerged and vanished beneath intermittent floods, then re-emerged, stabilized, and coalesced into continents, ultimately forming the familiar geographical layout we see today. The solid Earth had wrestled from the liquid domain 37.657 million square miles, or 12.96 billion acres. The contours of the continents allow us to divide the global ocean into 5 distinct regions: the Arctic and Antarctic, both frozen realms, and the Indian, Atlantic, and Pacific Oceans. The Pacific, stretching from pole to pole and spanning 145 degrees of longitude between Asia and America, is the most serene of seas. Its currents flow wide and slow, its tides are moderate, and rainfall is plentiful. This was the ocean fate had chosen for my maiden voyage, under these extraordinary circumstances. Professor, Captain Nemo's voice cut through the air. Let us establish our bearings and mark the starting point of this expedition. It's 1:15. I shall ascend to the surface. With a practiced hand, the captain tapped an electric clock thrice. Pumps whirred into action, expelling water from the ballast tanks. The manometer's needle reflected the Nautilus's ascent, then steadied. "We have arrived," Nemo declared. I made my way to the central companionway leading to the upper deck, climbing the iron steps to emerge atop the Nautilus. The deck was barely 3 feet above the waterline. The vessel's bow and stern tapered to a point, justifying the comparison to a cigar. I noted the overlapping iron plates, resembling the scales of a massive terrestrial reptile, explaining why the Nautilus could be mistaken for a sea creature, even through binoculars. Amidships, the longboat, nestled partially within the hull, formed a slight bulge. Fore and aft, 2 mid-sized angled structures, partially enclosed by thick convex lenses, protruded from the deck. One housed the helmsman who steered the Nautilus, while the other contained a powerful lantern to illuminate the path ahead. The sea was a breathtaking panorama of azure, the sky a pristine canvas. The vessel barely registered the gentle swells of the ocean. A light easterly breeze ruffled the surface. The horizon, clear and unobstructed, offered excellent visibility. There was nothing in sight, no shoals, no islands, only a vast empty expanse. Captain Nemo, with his sextant, measured the sun's altitude to determine our latitude. He waited patiently until the sun's disk grazed the horizon, his hand as steady as a statue's as he took his readings. "Noon, Professor," Captain Nemo announced. "Whenever you're ready." I took one last glimpse of the sea, tinged golden by the Japanese coast, before descending to the saloon. "Now, sir, I shall leave you to your studies," Nemo said. "Our course is east-northeast at a depth of 26 fathoms. These detailed maps will allow you to track our progress. The saloon is yours to enjoy. With your permission, I shall retire." With a courteous bow, he departed, leaving me alone with my thoughts, all centered on the enigmatic commander of the Nautilus. For an hour, I pondered the mysteries surrounding him. My eyes then fell upon the enormous wall map, and I traced my finger to the intersection of our current latitude and longitude. Like continents, the ocean has its own vast rivers, distinct currents defined by temperature and color. The most renowned of these is the Gulf Stream. Science has charted 5 major currents, one in the North Atlantic, another in the South Atlantic, one in the North Pacific, one in the South Pacific, and a 5th in the Southern Indian Ocean. There's even evidence suggesting a 6th current once flowed in the Northern Indian Ocean, back when the Caspian and Aral Seas formed a single colossal body of water. The spot marked on the map revealed one such current, the Kuroshivo, or Black River. Originating in the Bay of Bengal, warmed by the intense tropical sun, it traverses the Strait of Malacca along the Asian coast, before veering into the North Pacific towards the Aleutian Islands. It carries with it camphor tree trunks and other regional flora, its warm indigo waters staining the ocean's edge. This was the current the Nautilus was to follow. I traced its path with my eye, watching it vanish into the vast Pacific, feeling myself drawn along with it. Just then, Ned Land and Conseil appeared at the saloon door. My companions were awestruck by the spectacle before them. "Where are we?" the Canadian exclaimed. "The Quebec Museum." "My friends," I said, gesturing for them to enter. "You are not in Canada, but aboard the Nautilus, 50 yards beneath the sea." Ned Land, ever the pragmatist, asked, "Professor, how many men are on this vessel? 10, 20, 50, 100? "I cannot say, Mr. Land. For now, we must abandon any thoughts of seizing the Nautilus or escaping. This ship is a marvel of modern engineering, and I would not have missed this experience for the world. Many would gladly trade places with us, if only to witness such wonders. So let us be patient and observe our surroundings." "Observe?" the harpooner scoffed. "We're trapped in an iron coffin, blind to the world outside." His words were barely uttered when the saloon was plunged into darkness. The luminous ceiling vanished so abruptly that my eyes ached from the sudden change. We stood frozen, unsure what surprise awaited us, be it pleasant or perilous. A scraping sound echoed through the vessel, as if panels were shifting within the Nautilus's hull. And then, an eerie green luminescence flooded the room. Suddenly, the saloon was bathed in an eerie green glow, emanating from 2 oblong openings on either side. The water beyond appeared vividly illuminated by electric beams. 2 thick crystal panels separated us from the sea. Initially, I shuddered, fearing the fragile barrier might shatter, but sturdy copper bands reinforced them, providing immense strength. The ocean was clearly visible for a mile around the Nautilus. It was a breathtaking spectacle, beyond the power of words to describe. Who could capture the interplay of light through those transparent walls of water? Subtle gradations from the depths, to the surface. The sea's renowned transparency, far exceeding that of spring water, is amplified by the mineral and organic matter suspended within it. In certain regions of the Antilles, sandy seabeds are visible with astonishing clarity even at depths of 75 fathoms. Sunlight penetrates the ocean to depths of 150 fathoms, but here, in the watery realm traversed by the Nautilus, electric light pierced the very heart of the waves. It was no longer merely illuminated water, but liquid light itself. Each window offered a glimpse into this unexplored abyss. The saloon's dimness accentuated the brilliance outside, and we peered out as if through the glass of a colossal aquarium. "You wanted to see, Ned, my friend," I said. "Now you see. Incredible, simply incredible," murmured the Canadian, his gruff demeanour momentarily forgotten as he succumbed to the scene's irresistible allure. "Worth travelling to the ends of the earth for a sight like this. Ah," I thought to myself, "I understand this man's existence now. He has created a world unto himself, a sanctuary for his most cherished wonders." For 2 hours, a mesmerising underwater ballet unfolded before us. I observed a vibrant array of marine life: the green wrasse, the striped mullet with its double black lines, the round-tailed goby, a white fish with violet spots, the Japanese mackerel with its iridescent blue body and silver head, the aptly named brilliant azurors, the banded rainbow fish with their multicoloured blue and yellow fins, sea robin, the Japanese salamander, the spider lamprey, and 6-foot-long serpents with small, lively eyes and mouths brimming with sharp teeth. Our imaginations soared, exclamations tumbling from our lips. Ned identified the fish, Conseil classified them, and I marvelled at their agility and exquisite forms. Never before had I been privileged to observe these creatures alive and unrestrained in their natural habitat. The sheer diversity of species parading before my dazzled eyes, a living tapestry of the seas of China and Japan, was overwhelming. Fish, more numerous than birds in the sky, flocked to us, drawn by the electric light's alluring glow. Abruptly, daylight returned to the saloon as the iron panels slid shut, extinguishing the enchanting vision. Lost in reverie, my gaze drifted to the instruments on the wall. The compass still indicated an east-northeast course. The pressure gauge showed 5 atmospheres, corresponding to a depth of 25 fathoms, and the electric log recorded a speed of 15 miles per hour. I anticipated Captain Nemo's return, but he remained absent. The clock chimed 5. Ned and Conseil retired to their cabin, and I sought the solace of my own. Dinner awaited, a delectable turtle soup made from the finest hawksbill, red mullet in puff pastry, its liver, prepared separately, was a delicacy, and fillets of emperor angelfish, surpassing even salmon in flavour. I spent the evening reading, writing, and contemplating. Sleep eventually overtook me, and I drifted into a deep slumber on my seaweed mattress while the Nautilus sped through the swift current of the Black River. Chapter 14. An Invitation from the Deep. The next day, November 9th, I awoke feeling refreshed after a solid 12 hours of sleep. As usual, Conseil appeared, inquiring about my rest and offering his assistance. He mentioned that Ned Land was still asleep, slumbering like a man who had done nothing else his entire life. I let Conseil chatter away, my mind preoccupied with Captain Nemo's absence during yesterday's meeting. I hoped to see him today. Dressed and eager, I entered the saloon, but it was empty. I immersed myself in examining the collection of shells displayed behind glass, then delved into the extensive volumes filled with rare marine plants, their vibrant colours preserved even in their dried state. Among these treasures, I noticed vorticella, sea fans, delicate red-hued Ceramiaceae, agaric in the shape of fans, and Padina pavonica resembling flat mushrooms, a complete catalogue of algae. The entire day passed without a visit from Captain Nemo. The saloon's panels remained closed, perhaps to prevent us from growing weary of these marvels. The Nautilus maintained an east-northeast course at 12 knots, cruising at a depth of 25 to 30 fathoms. November the 10th brought the same isolation and solitude. I didn't encounter a single crew member. Ned and Conseil spent most of the day with me, both puzzled by the captain's inexplicable absence. Was he unwell? Had he changed his mind about us? Conseil, ever the optimist, reminded us that we enjoyed complete freedom and were well fed. Our host was upholding his end of the bargain. We had no cause for complaint, and our peculiar situation offered such extraordinary rewards that we couldn't justifiably criticize it yet. That day, I began chronicling our adventures in a journal, which has allowed me to recount them with meticulous detail. I wrote on paper made from Zostera marina, a type of seaweed. Early on November 11th, the influx of fresh air into the Nautilus signaled our ascent to the surface to replenish our oxygen supply. I made my way to the central staircase and climbed to the deck. It was 6 o'clock. The weather was overcast, the sea grey but calm, barely a ripple disturbing its surface. Would I encounter Captain Nemo? I saw only the helmsman, confined to his glass-enclosed station. Perched on the ledge formed by the dinghy's hull, I inhaled the salty air with relish. Gradually, the sun's rays pierced the fog. Rising from the eastern horizon, the sea shimmered beneath its gaze like a trail of ignited gunpowder. Clouds scattered across the sky, painted with vibrant hues, formed numerous mare's tails, a harbinger of wind. But wind held no threat for the Nautilus, impervious to any storm. As I marveled at the glorious sunrise, I heard footsteps approaching. I prepared to greet Captain Nemo, but it was his first mate, whom I had seen during the captain's initial visit. He strode onto the deck, seemingly oblivious to my presence. With a powerful telescope, he scanned the horizon meticulously. Once his examination was complete, he approached a panel and uttered a cryptic phrase, "Nautron respok lorni virch." Its meaning eluded me. With those words, he descended below deck. I assumed the Nautilus was about to resume its underwater journey, so I returned to my quarters. 5 days passed without any change in our circumstances. Each morning, I ventured onto the deck, only to hear the same enigmatic phrase spoken by the same individual. Captain Nemo remained absent. I had resigned myself to never seeing him again when, on November 16th, upon returning to my room with Ned and Conseil, I found a note addressed to me on the table. I eagerly opened it. The handwriting was bold and clear, the characters angular, reminiscent of German script. The note read as follows: November 16th, 1867. To Professor Aronnax, on board the Nautilus. Captain Nemo cordially invites Professor Aronnax to a hunting expedition, scheduled for tomorrow morning in the forests of Crespo Island. He trusts that nothing will prevent the professor's attendance and would be delighted if his companions joined them. Captain Nemo, commander of the Nautilus. "A hunt!" Ned exclaimed, eyes widening. "In the forests of Crespo Island," Conseil added, his voice filled with wonder. "So the captain's venturing onto dry land?" Ned questioned, a hint of excitement in his tone. "That seems to be the implication," I replied, rereading the invitation. "Well then, we'll accept," the Canadian declared. "Once we're back on solid ground, we'll figure out our next move. Besides, I wouldn't mind sinking my teeth into some fresh venison." Despite the apparent contradiction between Captain Nemo's aversion to islands and continents and his invitation to hunt in a forest, I simply responded, "Let's first determine the location of Crespo Island." Consulting the map, I found a small island at 32°40 north latitude and 157°50 west longitude, identified in 1801 by Captain Crespo and marked on old Spanish charts as Roca de la Plata, or the Silver Rock. We were roughly 1,800 miles from our starting point, and the Nautilus, with a slight course correction, was now heading southeast. I showed the tiny speck in the vast North Pacific to my companions. "If Captain Nemo does occasionally set foot on land," I remarked, "he certainly has a penchant for desolate islands." Ned shrugged non-committally. and both he and Conseil left me to my thoughts. After dinner, served by the ever-silent steward, I retired to bed, a sense of anticipation mingled with unease. The following morning, November 17th, I awoke to the sensation of the Nautilus at a standstill. I quickly dressed and entered the saloon. Captain Nemo was there waiting for me. He rose, bowed, and inquired if I was ready to accompany him. He made no mention of his recent absence, so I followed suit and simply confirmed that my companions and I were prepared to join him. We entered the dining room, where breakfast was served. "Professor Aronnax," the captain began, "please join me for breakfast. We can converse while we eat. Although I promised you a walk in the forest, I didn't guarantee we'd find any restaurants there. So eat heartily, as you may not have another meal until much later." I did justice to the spread, which consisted of various fish, sliced sea cucumbers, surprisingly delicious, and different types of seaweed. Our beverage was pure water, to which the captain added a few drops of a fermented concoction derived from a seaweed known as dulce, using a Kamchatka method. Captain Nemo ate in silence at first, then addressed me. "Professor, when I invited you to hunt in my underwater forest on Crespo Island, you clearly thought me delusional. You should never underestimate anyone, sir. But Captain, please believe me." "Kindly hear me out," Nemo interrupted, "and then you can judge whether I've been foolish or contradictory. I'm listening." "As you know, Professor, humans can survive underwater with a sufficient air supply. In underwater construction, workers wear airtight suits with metal helmets, receiving air from above through pumps and regulators." "You're referring to diving equipment," I clarified. "Precisely. However, in that scenario, the diver is tethered to the pump that supplies air through a rubber hose. If we were similarly bound to the Nautilus, our exploration would be severely limited." "So how do you overcome this limitation?" I asked, intrigued. "We utilize the Rouquayrol apparatus," Nemo explained, "invented by two of your fellow countrymen, which I have refined for my own purposes. It allows you to venture into these extreme environments without any adverse effects on your body. It consists of a robust iron reservoir, where I store air at a pressure of 50 atmospheres. This reservoir is secured to the back with straps, similar to a soldier's backpack. The upper section houses a bellows mechanism, ensuring the air remains contained until released at normal pressure. The Rouquayrol apparatus, as we employ it, features two rubber tubes connected to a mask covering the nose and mouth. One tube delivers fresh air, the other expels exhaled air, and the tongue acts as a valve, controlling airflow as needed. However, to withstand the immense pressure at great depths, I've enclosed my head in a copper sphere, akin to a diving helmet. The two tubes, the intake and exhaust, are connected to this sphere." "Ingenious, Captain Nemo," I replied. "But surely the air supply you carry is limited. Once the oxygen level drops below 15%, it becomes unbreathable." "Indeed, Professor. But as I mentioned, the Nautilus pumps enable me to compress air to high pressures. Under these conditions, the apparatus reservoir can provide breathable air for 9 to 10 hours. I have no further objections," I conceded. "But I must inquire, Captain, how do you illuminate your path in the ocean's depths?" "We employ the Ruhmkorff apparatus, Mem Aronnax. One unit is worn on the back, the other attached to the waist. It consists of a Bunsen battery, powered by sodium rather than potassium dichromate. A wire collects the generated electricity and directs it to a specially designed lantern. Inside the lantern, a glass coil filled with a small amount of carbon dioxide glows with a bright, continuous white light when the apparatus is activated. With this, I can both breathe and see." "Captain Nemo," I admitted, "your answers to my inquiries are so comprehensive that I can no longer doubt you. However, while I accept the Rouquayrol and Ruhmkorff devices, I must express some reservations about the weapon I am to carry." "But it is not a firearm in the traditional sense," the captain clarified. "Then it must be an airgun." "Precisely. How could I possibly manufacture gunpowder on board without saltpeter, sulfur, or charcoal? Besides, I added, firing underwater in a medium 855 times denser than air would require overcoming considerable resistance. That poses no challenge. There exist specialized guns, designed by Fulton and refined by Philip Coles and Burley in England, Furcy in France, and Landi in Italy, with unique sealing mechanisms that allow them to fire under these conditions. But as I mentioned, lacking gunpowder, I utilize highly compressed air, readily supplied by the Nautilus pumps. But surely that air supply would be quickly exhausted. Indeed. But do I not have my Rouquayrol reservoir to replenish it as needed? A simple valve controls the flow. Besides, Monsieur Aronnax, you must realize that during our underwater hunt, we will expend minimal air and ammunition. Still, I persisted, it seems that in this dim environment and dense medium, the shots wouldn't travel far or be particularly lethal. On the contrary, Professor, with this weapon every shot is fatal. Even a glancing blow will instantly incapacitate the creature. How is that possible? The projectiles fired from this gun are not ordinary bullets, but small glass spheres invented by the Austrian chemist Enigmatic, of which I have an ample supply. These glass spheres are encased in steel and weighted with lead pellets. They are essentially Leyden jars, charged with high-voltage electricity. The slightest impact triggers their discharge, electrocuting the target, no matter how large or powerful. I concede, I replied, rising from my seat. I have no choice but to take the weapon. In any case, I shall follow where you lead. Captain Nemo led me towards the stern. As we passed Ned and Conseil's cabin, I called for them, and they quickly joined us. We then arrived at a small compartment near the engine room, where our diving suits awaited. Chapter 15. A stroll on the ocean floor. The chamber, in essence, served as the Nautilus armory and dressing room. A dozen diving suits hung from the wall, ready for our use. Ned Land, upon seeing them, balked at the idea of donning one. "But my dear Ned," I explained, "the forests of Crespo Island are underwater forests." "Great," the harpooner grumbled, his dreams of fresh venison dashed. "And you, Professor Aronnax, are you truly going to wear that get-up?" "There's no other option, Ned." "Suit yourself, sir," he replied, shrugging his broad shoulders. "But I won't be caught dead in one unless I'm forced." "Rest assured, Master Ned," Captain Nemo interjected. "No one will force you." "What about Conseil? Is he willing to risk it?" Ned asked, seeking an ally in his skepticism. "I go where my master goes," Conseil replied, his loyalty unwavering. At the captain's command, 2 crewmen assisted us in putting on the heavy, airtight suits, fashioned from seamless rubber and designed to withstand immense pressure. They felt like flexible suits of armor, covering our bodies from head to toe. The trousers ended in thick boots with weighted lead soles. Copper bands crisscrossed the chest area of the jacket, protecting our lungs from the crushing depths while allowing them to function freely. The sleeves terminated in gloves that didn't hinder hand movement. These state-of-the-art suits were a far cry from the archaic cork breastplates and jackets used in the 18th century. Soon, Captain Nemo, a powerfully built crewman who seemed capable of Herculean feats, Conseil and I were suited up. The only remaining step was to enclose our heads within the metal helmets. Before doing so, I requested the captain's permission to examine the weapons we were to carry. A crewman handed me a streamlined rifle with a large steel butt, hollowed out in the center to serve as a reservoir for compressed air. A spring-loaded valve regulated the airflow into a metal tube. A compartment within the butt contained around 20 electrically charged projectiles, propelled into the barrel by a spring mechanism. Each shot was automatically replaced by the next. "Captain Nemo," I observed, "this weapon is impressive and appears easy to use. I only ask for the opportunity to test it, but how shall we reach the ocean floor?" "At this moment, Professor," Nemo replied, "the Nautilus rests on the seabed in 5 fathoms of water. We simply need to step outside." But how will we move? You shall see. Captain Nemo secured his helmet. Conseil and I followed suit, ignoring Ned's sarcastic quip of happy hunting. The upper part of our suits terminated in a copper collar, to which the metal helmet was screwed. 3 thick glass viewing ports offered a wide field of vision as we moved our heads within the helmets. Once sealed, the Rouquayrol apparatus on our backs activated, and I found myself breathing comfortably. Equipped with a Ruhmkorff lamp on my belt and the rifle in hand, I was ready to embark on this underwater adventure. However, encumbered by the heavy suit and anchored to the deck by the leaden soles, I couldn't take a single step. This situation, however, had been anticipated. I found myself propelled into a small compartment adjacent to the dressing room, my companions following suit. A watertight door, reinforced with ceiling plates, clanged shut behind us, plunging us into absolute darkness. Moments later, a loud hiss filled the chamber. I felt a chill creeping up from my feet to my chest as water, entering through an unseen valve, rapidly filled the room. A second door on the Nautilus's hull then opened, revealing a dim light. In the next instant, our boots hit the ocean floor. How can I possibly describe the awe-inspiring experience of walking beneath the waves? Words fail to capture such wonders. Captain Nemo led the way, his companion trailing behind. Conseil and I stayed close, though conversation was impossible through our metal helmets. The weight of my suit, boots, air tank, and helmet, within which my head rattled like a seed in its shell, vanished in this alien environment. The light illuminating the seabed, 30 feet below the surface, was astonishingly bright. Sunlight effortlessly pierced the water, devoid of color distortion. I could clearly make out objects up to 150 yards away, beyond which hues gradually shifted to deep ultramarine, fading into the murky depths. The water around me was like a denser version of air, yet nearly as transparent. Above me, the sea's surface remained undisturbed. We walked on smooth, firm sand. Unlike the rippled texture of a beach molded by waves, this radiant underwater plane, acting as a natural reflector, intensified the sunlight, creating a vibrant energy that seemed to permeate every molecule of water. It was incredible. Even at this depth, visibility rivaled that of broad daylight. For 15 minutes, I traversed this sandy expanse, dotted with the finest shell fragments. The Nautilus, resembling a long reef, gradually disappeared from view, but its beacon would serve as our guide back to the ship in the darkness. Soon, shapes emerged in the distance. I recognized magnificent rock formations adorned with a tapestry of exquisite zoophytes. The unique visual effect of this underwater world captivated me. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. The sun's rays struck the water's surface at an angle, refracting and diffracting into a spectrum of colors that painted the edges of flowers, rocks, plants, shells, and coral. It was a breathtaking spectacle, a kaleidoscope of greens, yellows, oranges, violets, indigos, and blues. A painter's dream palette come to life. How I wished I could share my exhilaration with Conseil to match his expressions of wonder. Perhaps Captain Nemo and his companion communicated through prearranged signals. Lacking that ability, I resorted to talking to myself, my voice echoing inside the copper helmet, likely wasting precious air on pointless words. A dazzling array of life unfolded before us. Various species of coral, iridescent fan coral, clusters of pure white sea whips, spiky fungi, and anemones created a vibrant underwater garden. Porcelain crabs adorned with blue-tipped claws scuttled across the sandy floor, alongside starfish and lace-like serpent stars, their delicate tendrils swaying in the gentle current we created. It pained me to trample the thousands of stunning mollusks scattered beneath our feet. Hammer oysters, leaping donax shells, wentletraps, red helmets, angel wings, and countless other treasures of this boundless ocean. But we had to keep moving, so we pressed on. While above us, schools of Portuguese man-o-war drifted, their long tentacles trailing behind them, and jellyfish with opalescent or rose-coloured bells, edged in blue, shielded us from the sun's rays. Bioluminescent comb jellies pulsed with an ethereal light that would have illuminated our path in the darkness. I witnessed all these marvels in the span of a quarter mile, barely pausing as I followed Captain Nemo's beckoning gestures. Soon, the terrain transformed. The sandy plain gave way to a stretch of viscous mud, known to Americans as ooze, a mixture of siliceous and calcareous shells. We then traversed a meadow of seaweed, a wild and lush expanse that felt soft and yielding underfoot, rivaling the finest carpets woven by human hands. While greenery flourished beneath us, it didn't abandon the surface above. A delicate network of marine plants, belonging to the vast family of seaweed, of which over 2,000 species are known, blanketed the water. I saw long ribbons of kelp undulating, some spherical, others bulbous. There were delicate sea lettuces and feather boas, and dulse resembling cactus fans. I noticed the green plants thrived closer to the surface, while reds occupied deeper waters, leaving the black and brown varieties to cultivate gardens in the ocean's depths. We had been exploring for nearly an hour and a half. It was approaching midday, as evidenced by the sun's rays now directly overhead, no longer refracted. The magical colours gradually faded, the emerald and sapphire hues diminishing. We marched with a steady pace, our footsteps echoing with surprising intensity. Even the slightest sound travelled with remarkable speed underwater. Sound travels 4 times faster in water than in air. The seabed began to slope downwards, the light taking on a uniform hue. We had reached a depth of 105 yards and 20 inches, experiencing a pressure of 6 atmospheres. Even at this depth, I could still perceive the sun's rays, though faintly. Their brilliant intensity had given way to a reddish twilight, the threshold between day and night. Visibility remained adequate, so we didn't need to activate our Ruhmkorff lamps yet. Suddenly, Captain Nemo came to a halt. He waited for me to catch up, and then gestured towards a dark mass looming in the distance. The forest of Crespo Island, I thought to myself, and I was right. Chapter 16, A Submarine Forest. We had reached the edge of the forest, undoubtedly one of the most magnificent in Captain Nemo's vast underwater domain. He regarded it as his personal sanctuary, as much his own as the first humans claimed the primordial Earth. And truly, who could challenge his ownership of this submerged paradise? What intrepid pioneer would dare venture here with an axe to fell these dark groves? The forest consisted of towering, tree-like plants. As we entered its grand arches, I was struck by the peculiar orientation of their branches, a phenomenon I had never encountered before. Not a blade of grass on the forest floor, not a branch on the trees was bent or broken, nor did they extend horizontally. All stretched upwards towards the ocean's surface. Even the most delicate filaments and ribbons stood as straight as iron rods, their vertical growth dictated by the dense medium that nurtured them. Though motionless when pushed aside, they instantly snapped back to their original positions. This was truly a realm of unwavering verticality. I soon adapted to this disorienting environment and the relative dimness that enveloped us. The forest floor appeared strewn with sharp rocks, making navigation tricky. The underwater flora was astonishingly diverse, even surpassing that of the Arctic or tropical zones, where plant life is less abundant. For a while, I mistakenly confused animal for plant, zoophyte for seaweed, an understandable error given the blurred lines between fauna and flora in this submerged world. These plants propagated independently, their life force drawn from the water that sustained them. Instead of leaves, most sported fronds in whimsical shapes and a spectrum of colours: pink, crimson, green, olive, fawn, and brown. I observed peacock-tail algae unfurled like fans, as if to capture a non-existent breeze, scarlet horn coral extending edible fern-like shoots, clusters of mushroom corals with upward thickening stems, and countless other marine plants, all devoid of flowers. A curious anomaly, a brilliant naturalist once remarked. a fantastical realm where the animal kingdom blossoms while the plant kingdom remains barren. Beneath these towering shrubs, as large as any temperate zone tree, in their cool shade, clustered vibrant living flowers, hedges of zoophytes blooming with yellow carnation corals and sinuous brain corals. Completing the illusion, butterfly fish flitted from branch to branch like a swarm of hummingbirds, while yellow pike blennies with bristling jaws, flying gurnards, and pinecone fish darted around our feet like a flock of startled birds. After about an hour, Captain Nemo signaled a halt. I was grateful for the respite, and we settled under an arbor of winged kelp, their long, slender blades resembling arrows. This brief rest was most welcome, lacking only the pleasure of conversation. Unable to speak or respond, I simply touched my copper helmet to Conseil's. His eyes sparkled with delight, and in a comical display of satisfaction, he wiggled within his air-filled suit. After 4 hours of walking, I was surprised by my lack of hunger. The reason for this eluded me. Instead, I felt an overwhelming urge to sleep, a common experience among divers. My eyes soon closed behind the thick glass, and I succumbed to a heavy slumber that only movement had previously kept at bay. Captain Nemo and his robust companion, reclining on the crystalline sand, had already set the example. I have no idea how long I remained in this state of drowsiness, but when I awoke, the sun appeared to be descending towards the horizon. Captain Nemo had already risen. As I began to stretch, a sudden apparition jolted me to my feet. A few paces away, a monstrous sea spider, nearly 3 feet tall, watched me with beady eyes, poised to pounce. Although my diving suit was thick enough to protect me from its bite, I couldn't suppress a shiver of dread. Conseil and the Nautilus crewman awoke at that moment. Captain Nemo gestured towards the grotesque creature, and a swift blow from the butt of his rifle sent it tumbling. I watched as its monstrous claws spasmed in its death throes. This incident served as a stark reminder that other, more formidable creatures might lurk in these murky depths, against which my suit offered no defense. I hadn't considered this before, but I resolved to remain vigilant. I assumed this would be the end of our excursion, but I was mistaken. Instead of returning to the Nautilus, Captain Nemo continued our daring trek. The seabed sloped downwards, the incline steepening, leading us to even greater depths. Around 3 o'clock, we reached a narrow canyon flanked by towering vertical walls, plunging to a depth of 75 fathoms. Thanks to our advanced equipment, we had descended 45 fathoms beyond the natural limit for human exploration. I say 75 fathoms, though I had no instruments to measure the distance, but I knew that even in the clearest water, sunlight couldn't penetrate further. The darkness grew deeper. After 10 paces, I could barely see anything. Just as I was fumbling along, a brilliant white light suddenly cut through the gloom. Captain Nemo had activated his electric lamp, followed by his companion. Conseil and I quickly did the same. With a twist of a dial, I established a connection between the wire and the glass coil, and the sea, illuminated by our 4 lamps, became visible for a radius of 36 yards. Captain Nemo continued his descent into the darkening forest, the trees thinning with each step. I observed that plant life vanished before animal life. The jellyfish had already deserted this barren terrain, but numerous creatures, zoophytes, arthropods, mollusks, and fish, still found sustenance here. As we walked, I assumed the glow of our Ruhmkorff lamps would attract some denizens from their shadowy hiding places. While some did approach, they maintained a respectful distance from the hunters. Several times, I saw Captain Nemo raise his rifle to his shoulder, only to lower it moments later and continue on. Finally, after roughly 4 hours, our extraordinary expedition reached its end. An imposing wall of magnificent rock, a towering mass of gigantic boulders, loomed before us. A colossal, sheer granite cliff, riddled with dark grottos but offering no feasible ascent. This was the base of Crespo Island. We had reached the Earth's crust. Captain Nemo abruptly stopped, signaling a halt with a gesture. As much as I longed to scale the wall, I was forced to comply. This marked the boundary of Captain Nemo's domain, a line he would not cross. Beyond lay a part of the world he refused to tread upon. Our return journey commenced. Captain Nemo, back at the head of our small group, confidently guided us along a different, steeper path, a more arduous climb. We rapidly ascended towards the surface, but our return was gradual enough to avoid the dangers of decompression sickness, a potentially fatal condition caused by a too rapid decrease in pressure. Soon, light reappeared and intensified. With the sun low on the horizon, the refracted light cast spectral halos around the various objects we encountered. At a depth of 15 feet, we walked amidst a swarm of tiny fish, more numerous and agile than birds in the air. We had yet to encounter any game worthy of a shot when Captain Nemo suddenly raised his rifle and tracked a moving target in the undergrowth. He fired. I heard a faint hiss. A creature collapsed, stunned, a short distance away. It was a magnificent sea otter, an enhydra, the only exclusively marine mammal. This otter, measuring 5 feet long, was undoubtedly valuable. Its fur, chestnut brown above and silvery below, would fetch a high price in Russian and Chinese markets. I admired this curious mammal with its rounded head adorned with small ears, round eyes, cat-like whiskers, webbed feet with claws and bushy tail. Once abundant, this prized animal, relentlessly hunted, had become increasingly rare, seeking refuge in the northern Pacific. Without such sanctuary, its survival would be in doubt. Captain Nemo's companion retrieved the beast, slinging it over his shoulder as we continued our journey. For an hour, a sandy plain stretched before us, occasionally rising to within a few feet of the surface. I saw our reflections mirrored in the water above, inverted and mimicking our movements, our counterparts walking upside down with their feet in the air. Another striking effect was the passage of what appeared to be dense clouds forming and dissipating rapidly. Upon closer inspection, I realized they were caused by varying densities of kelp on the seafloor. I could even see the delicate foam from their broken tips dancing on the surface, along with the shadows of large birds soaring overhead, their swift flight visible against the sky. At that moment, I witnessed one of the most exhilarating sights a hunter could experience. A massive bird with a vast wingspan glided towards us, hovering overhead. Captain Nemo's companion raised his rifle and fired when it was mere yards above the waves. The creature plummeted, stunned, and was quickly retrieved by the agile hunter. It was a magnificent albatross. Our march continued uninterrupted. For 2 hours, we followed the sandy plains, then navigated through fields of seaweed, a challenging terrain to cross. I was frankly exhausted when a glimmer of light pierced the darkness. The Nautilus's beacon, half a mile away. In less than 20 minutes, we would be back on board, and I could finally breathe freely, as the oxygen in my reservoir was running low. But an unexpected encounter delayed our return. I had fallen behind when Captain Nemo suddenly rushed towards me, his strong hand pushing me to the ground. His companion did the same to Conseil. Initially, I was bewildered by this sudden attack, but I soon relaxed when I saw the captain lying beside me, motionless, flattened on the seabed under the cover of a kelp thicket. I lifted my head and saw an immense phosphorescent shape gliding ominously by. My blood ran cold as I recognized 2 massive sharks circling us. These were tiger sharks, formidable creatures with enormous tails and a blank, glassy stare. Phosphorescent fluid oozed from pores around their snouts. These monstrous beasts could easily crush a man with their powerful jaws. I didn't know if Conseil had time to classify them. I, for one, observed their silvery underbellies and rows of razor-sharp teeth from the perspective of a potential prey, not a scientist. Fortunately, these apex predators have poor eyesight. They passed by without noticing us, their rough skin brushing against our suits. We had narrowly escaped a fate far worse than encountering a tiger in the jungle. Half an hour later, guided by the electric light, we reached the Nautilus. The outer hatch was open, and Captain Nemo sealed it behind us as we entered the airlock chamber. He then pressed a button, activating the pumps. I felt the water draining away, and within moments the chamber was empty. The inner door opened, and we stepped into the dressing room. With some effort, our diving suits were removed. Exhausted and famished, I returned to my quarters, still marveling at this extraordinary underwater expedition. Chapter 17, 4,000 Leagues Beneath the Pacific. The next morning, November 18th, fully recovered from the previous day's exertions, I ascended to the deck just as the first mate uttered his daily incantation. I was taking in the ocean's grandeur when Captain Nemo appeared. Seemingly unaware of my presence, he began a series of astronomical observations. Upon finishing, he leaned against the lantern housing, his gaze lost in the vast expanse. Meanwhile, several Nautilus crewmen, all robust and healthy, emerged onto the deck to haul in the nets cast the night before. These sailors were clearly of diverse origins, though all bore European features. I recognized a few as Irish, some French, others Slavic, and one who appeared Greek or Cretan. They were polite, communicated amongst themselves in a peculiar language I couldn't decipher. The nets were hoisted aboard. They were massive trawl nets, similar to those used on the Normandy coast. Gaping mouths held open by the waves, and a chain threaded through their fine mesh. These nets, dragged by iron poles, swept through the water, scooping up everything in their path. Today's catch included fascinating specimens from these fertile waters. I estimated the haul to be over 900 pounds of fish, a substantial catch, but not surprising given the extended duration and wide reach of the nets. We had no shortage of excellent food, and the Nautilus' speed, combined with the allure of its electric lights, ensured a constant supply. The day's catch was promptly lowered through a hatch to the galley, some destined for immediate consumption, others for preservation. With the fishing complete and our air supply replenished, I assumed the Nautilus was about to continue its underwater voyage and turned to head back to my quarters. But without warning, the captain addressed me. "Professor," he began, his voice charged with an unusual intensity. "Isn't this ocean a living, breathing entity? It has its moods, its tempers. Yesterday, it slumbered alongside us, and now it awakens, refreshed after a peaceful night. Observe," he continued, gesturing towards the sea. "It stirs under the sun's caress, ready to resume its daily cycle. It's a fascinating study, this interplay of its elements. The ocean has a pulse, arteries, even spasms. I concur with the esteemed Matthew Morey, who discovered a circulatory system in the ocean as real as that found in animals." "Yes," I agreed, "the ocean does have a circulation, and to facilitate it, the Creator has filled it with an abundance of heat, salt, and microorganisms." As Captain Nemo spoke, a transformation seemed to wash over him, stirring a strange excitement within me. "True life thrives down there," he continued, his eyes gleaming with a visionary fervor. "I envision underwater cities, clusters of submerged dwellings that, like the Nautilus, would ascend each morning to breathe at the surface. Free, autonomous communities. Yet, who knows whether some tyrannical ruler..." He abruptly cut off his sentence with a dismissive wave, then turned back to me as if to dispel a troubling thought. "Pierre Aronnax," he inquired, "are you familiar with the ocean's depths?" "I only know, Captain, what the major soundings have revealed. Would you enlighten me with those figures, so I may align them with my own data?" "Here are some that I recall," I replied. "If I'm not mistaken, a depth of 8,000 yards has been recorded in the North Atlantic and 2,500 yards in the Mediterranean. The most remarkable soundings, however, were taken in the South Atlantic near the 35th parallel, revealing depths of 12,000, 14,000, and even 15,000 yards. In general, it's estimated that if the ocean floor were leveled, its average depth would be around 1¾ leagues. "Well, Professor," Captain Nemo responded with a sly grin, "I believe we can show you depths far greater than that. As for the average depth in this region of the Pacific, I assure you it's a mere 4,000 yards. With that, he strode towards the hatch and descended the ladder. I followed him into the spacious lounge. The propeller engaged, and the log indicated a speed of 20 miles per hour. In the days and weeks that followed, Captain Nemo's appearances were infrequent. I rarely saw him. The first mate meticulously plotted our course on the chart, allowing me to track the Nautilus's movements. For some time, the lounge panels were opened almost daily, and we never tired of exploring the mysteries of the underwater world. The Nautilus generally maintained a southeasterly course, cruising at depths between 100 and 150 yards. On one occasion, however, for reasons unknown, the Nautilus, angled by its diving planes, grazed the ocean floor. The thermometer registered a temperature of 4.25 degrees Celsius, a common reading at that depth across all latitudes. At 3 a.m. on November 26th, the Nautilus crossed the Tropic of Cancer at 172 degrees longitude. By the 27th, we had reached the Sandwich Islands, where Captain Cook met his tragic end in 1779. We had travelled 4,860 leagues from our starting point. That morning, as I stood on the deck, I could see Hawaii, the largest of the 7 islands, 2 miles to windward. I clearly made out the cultivated fields, the parallel mountain ranges, and the towering volcanoes of Mauna Kea, soaring 16,000 feet above sea level. Among other things, the nets brought up unique specimens of fan coral and delicate polyps specific to this region. The Nautilus continued southeast, crossing the equator on December 1st at 142 degrees longitude. On the 4th, after a swift and uneventful journey, we reached the Marquesas Islands. 3 miles distant, I spotted Mount Tametiu on Nuku Hiva, the largest island in the French Polynesian archipelago. I could only discern the forested mountains against the horizon, as Captain Nemo chose not to bring the ship closer to shore. Here, the nets yielded a bounty of beautiful fish, some with azure fins and golden tails, boasting unparalleled taste. Others nearly scaleless, yet incredibly flavorful, and some with bony jaws and yellow-tinged gills, rivaling the finest tuna. After departing these picturesque islands under the French flag, the Nautilus covered some 2,000 miles between December 4th and 11th. On the afternoon of December 11th, I was engrossed in a book in the lounge. Ned Land and Conseil watched the illuminated waters through the partially open panels. The Nautilus was stationary. While its reservoirs refilled, it hovered at a depth of 1,000 yards, a rarely explored zone where large fish were seldom encountered. I was reading Jean Masset's captivating book, The Slaves of the Stomach, absorbing its valuable insights, when Conseil interrupted me. "Would you come here for a moment, Professor?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. "What is it, Conseil?" "I'd like you to see this." I rose, walked over, and leaned on the glass panels to get a better look. In the glare of the electric lights, a massive black object, completely motionless, hung suspended in the water. I studied it intently, trying to discern the nature of this enormous creature. Then, a sudden thought struck me. "A ship," I blurted out. "Aye," Ned confirmed. "A sunken vessel, resting upright." He was right. We were near a ship, its tattered rigging still dangling from the chains. The keel appeared intact, suggesting the wreck was recent, maybe only a few hours old. 3 broken masts, snapped just above the deck, indicated the ship had been forced to sacrifice them in a desperate attempt to survive. But the vessel, now lying on its side, had taken on water and was listing heavily to port. This skeletal remnant of its former glory was a haunting sight, lying forsaken beneath the waves. Even more heartbreaking was the scene on the deck, where several bodies, still lashed by ropes, remained. I counted 5, 4 men, one still gripping the helm, and a woman clutching a baby in her arms. The woman was young, her features, preserved by the cold water, illuminated by the Nautilus lights. In a final act of desperation, she had lifted her child above her head. Poor little thing, its arms wrapped around her neck. The sight of the 4 sailors was horrifying. their bodies contorted in their final struggles to break free from the ropes that bound them to the ship. Only the helmsman, his face serene and resolute, his grey hair plastered to his forehead, seemed to still be steering the 3 broken masts through the depths. It was a devastating tableau. We were speechless, our hearts pounding at the sight of this maritime tragedy frozen in time. I could already envision the monstrous sharks, drawn by the scent of human flesh, converging on the wreck with hungry eyes. But then the Nautilus veered course, circling the submerged vessel. In an instant, I read the inscription on the stern: the Florida, Sunderland. Chapter 18. Vanikoro. This harrowing incident foreshadowed a series of maritime disasters the Nautilus would encounter on its journey. As we ventured into more frequented waters, we often spotted the decaying hulls of shipwrecked vessels littering the depths, and deeper still, rusting cannons, bullets, anchors, chains, and countless other iron remnants. On December 11th, we sighted the Tuamotu archipelago, the former dangerous archipelago, charted by Bougainville, stretching over 500 leagues from Ducie Island to Lazarev Island. This vast expanse covers 370 square leagues and comprises 60 island clusters, notably the Gambia Islands, a French territory. These are coral islands, slowly emerging from the tireless work of coral polyps. Over time, this new land will merge with neighbouring islands, potentially forming a 5th continent, extending from New Zealand and New Caledonia to the Marquesas Islands. I once shared this theory with Captain Nemo, but he retorted coldly, "The Earth doesn't need new continents, but new men." Fate guided the Nautilus towards Clermont-Tonnerre, one of the most intriguing islands in the archipelago. Discovered in 1822 by Captain Bell of the Minerva, this gave me an opportunity to study the madreporic formations responsible for the islands in this region. Madrepores, not to be confused with corals, have tissue covered in a calcareous crust. Variations in their structure led my esteemed mentor, Milne Edwards, to classify them into 5 distinct categories. The minuscule creatures secreted by these marine organisms reside in vast colonies within their cells. Their calcium deposits accumulate to form rocks, reefs, and islands, both large and small. In some places, they create ring-shaped atolls enclosing lagoons connected to the sea by channels. In others, like Réunion and Mauritius, they build fringing reefs, tall vertical walls bordering deep waters. Just a few hundred yards from Clermont-Tonnerre's shores, I marveled at the colossal structures built by these microscopic architects. These walls are primarily the work of stony corals like Millepora, porites, and various species of star coral. These polyps flourish in turbulent waters near the surface, initiating their construction from the top and gradually burying themselves in the debris of their own secretions. This, at least, is Darwin's theory, which, in my opinion, surpasses the notion that these formations are the peaks of submerged mountains or volcanoes. I could examine these extraordinary walls up close as they descended vertically for over 300 yards, brilliantly illuminated by our electric lights. When Conseil inquired about the time required to build these immense barriers, I astonished him by explaining that scientists estimate a growth rate of only 1/8 of an inch per century. By evening, Clermont-Tonnerre faded into the distance, and the Nautilus altered course. After crossing the Tropic of Capricorn at 135 degrees longitude, it sailed northwest, returning to the tropical zone. Despite the intense summer sun, we remained comfortable, as the temperature 15 to 20 fathoms below the surface never exceeded 10 to 12 degrees Celsius. On December 15th, we left the enchanting Society Islands and the picturesque Tahiti, Queen of the Pacific, to the east. In the morning, I glimpsed the island's lofty peaks several miles to windward. These waters provided our table with exquisite fish, mackerel, tuna, and even a few varieties of sea snakes. On December 25th, the Nautilus entered the waters of the New Hebrides. an archipelago discovered by Quiros in 1606, explored by Bougainville in 1768, and named by Cook in 1773. This island chain consists primarily of 9 large islands, forming a 120-league band from north-northwest to south-southeast, between 15 degrees and 20 degrees south latitude and 164 degrees and 168 degrees longitude. We passed reasonably close to the island of Erromango, which, at midday, appeared as a mass of verdant forest crowned by a towering peak. Being Christmas Day, Ned Land expressed his disappointment at the lack of festivities, a holiday cherished by Protestants. I hadn't seen Captain Nemo for a week when, on the morning of the 27th, he entered the lounge, as if we had last met only moments ago. I was engrossed in tracing the Nautilus's course on the map when he approached, placed his finger on a specific point, and uttered a single word. Vanikoro. The effect was electrifying. It was the name of the islands where La Pérouse had vanished. I abruptly rose from my seat. "The Nautilus has brought us to Vanikoro?" I asked, incredulous. "Indeed, Professor," the captain confirmed. "And I can visit the infamous islands where the Beausoleil and the Astrolabe met their fate. If you wish, Professor. When will we arrive?" "We are already there." Following Captain Nemo, I ascended to the deck, eagerly scanning the horizon. To the northeast, 2 volcanic islands of unequal size emerged, encircled by a coral reef 40 miles in circumference. We were off the coast of Vanikoro, specifically the island Dumont d'Urville, named Recherche Island, directly opposite the small harbour of Vanu, located at 16°4 south latitude and 164°32 east longitude. Lush vegetation covered the land from the shore to the island's interior, culminating in Mount Kapogo, rising 1,565 feet high. The Nautilus, having navigated the outer barrier reef through a narrow passage, found itself in the midst of breaking waves, the water 30 to 40 fathoms deep. Beneath the verdant canopy of mangroves, I spotted several natives who seemed startled by our approach. Did they perceive the long, dark shape moving between wind and water as a menacing sea creature? Captain Nemo inquired about my knowledge of La Pérouse's ill-fated expedition. "Only what's common knowledge, Captain," I replied. "And could you enlighten me on this common knowledge?" he asked with a hint of irony. "Certainly." I recounted the findings of Dumont d'Urville's latest works, summarizing them as follows. In 1785, Louis XVI dispatched La Pérouse and his second-in-command, Captain de Langley, on a voyage of circumnavigation. They set sail on the corvettes Boussole and Astrolabe, never to be heard from again. In 1791, the French government, growing concerned about the ship's fate, commissioned 2 merchant vessels, the Recherche and the Espérance, under the command of Bruni d'Entrecasteaux, to search for them. 2 months into their voyage, they received word from Captain Bowen of the Albemarle that wreckage had been sighted off the coast of New Georgia. However, d'Entrecasteaux, disregarding this somewhat unreliable information, steered towards the Admiralty Islands, mentioned in a report by Captain Hunter as the possible site of La Pérouse's shipwreck. Their search proved fruitless. The Espérance and Recherche sailed past Vanikoro without stopping, and the expedition ended in disaster, claiming the lives of d'Entrecasteaux, 2 of his lieutenants, and several crew members. Captain Dillon, a savvy old Pacific sailor, was the first to uncover concrete evidence of the wrecks. On May 15, 1824, his ship, the St. Patrick, passed near Utopia, one of the New Hebrides Islands. There, a Lascar approached in a canoe, offering to sell him a silver sword hilt bearing engraved characters. The Lascar claimed that 6 years prior, during a visit to Vanikoro, he had encountered 2 Europeans who belonged to ships that had wrecked on the reefs years earlier. Dillon surmised these were survivors from La Pérouse's expedition, whose disappearance had captivated the world. He attempted to reach Vanikoro, where, according to the Lascar, he would find remnants of the wreckage, but adverse winds and currents thwarted his efforts. Returning to Calcutta, Dillon sought the support of the Asiatic Society and the East India Company, who provided him with a vessel aptly named the Recherche. On January 23, 1827, he embarked on a new expedition, accompanied by a French representative. After calling at several Pacific islands, the Recherche dropped anchor off Vanikoro on July 7, 1827, in the very harbour of Vanu, where the Nautilus now rested. There, they recovered numerous artefacts from the wreckage: iron tools, anchors, tackle blocks, swivel guns, an 18-pound cannonball, fragments of scientific instruments, a piece of crown moulding, and a bronze clock inscribed with Basamea Fate, indicating it was cast at the Brest Arsenal around 1785. The evidence was irrefutable. After conducting a thorough investigation, Dillon remained at the ill-fated site until October. He then departed Vanikoro, charting a course for New Zealand before returning to Calcutta on April 7, 1828, and eventually to France, where he received a hero's welcome from Charles I. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Dillon, Dumont d'Urville had already embarked on his own quest to locate the wreckage. Reports from whalers had reached them, mentioning medals and a cross of St. Louis found in the possession of natives in the Louisiade archipelago and New Caledonia. Dumont d'Urville, commanding the Astrolabe, set sail and arrived in Hobart, Tasmania, 2 months after Dillon had left Vanikoro. There, he learned of Dillon's findings and discovered that James Hobbs, second mate of the Union of Calcutta, had spotted iron bars and red cloth among the natives of an island located at 8° 18 south latitude and 156° 30 east longitude. Dumont d'Urville, perplexed and unsure whether to trust these accounts from less reputable sources, decided to follow Dillon's path. On February 10, 1828, the Astrolabe reached Utopia and enlisted a deserter as a guide and interpreter. They made their way to Vanikoro, sighting it on the 12th, navigating the reefs until the 14th, and finally anchoring within the barrier reef in Vanu harbour on the 20th. On the 23rd, several officers explored the island, returning with only minor trinkets. The natives, evasive and tight-lipped, refused to lead them to the site of the wrecks. This suspicious behaviour led the French to believe the islanders had mistreated the shipwreck crews. The natives, in turn, seemed to fear that Dumont d'Urville had come to avenge La Pérouse and his unfortunate men. On the 26th, however, islanders, appeased by gifts and realising they had nothing to fear, led Monsieur Jacquireo to the site of the wrecks. There, in 12 feet of water, nestled between the Pacu and Vanu reefs, lay anchors, cannons, and bars of lead and iron encrusted with coral. The Astrolabe's longboat and whaleboat were dispatched to the location, and with considerable effort, the crew salvaged an anchor weighing 1,800 pounds, a brass cannon, some iron bars, and 2 copper swivel guns. Through conversations with the natives, Dumont d'Urville learned that after losing both ships on the island's reefs, La Pérouse and his crew had constructed a smaller boat, only to be lost at sea once again. Its final resting place remained unknown. Unbeknownst to Dumont d'Urville, the French government, concerned that he might be unaware of Dillon's findings, had dispatched the sloop Bayonnaise, commanded by Leguerant de Tromelin, to Vanikoro from its station on the west coast of America. The Bayonnaise arrived several months after the Astrolabe's departure, finding no new evidence, but confirming that the islanders had respected the monument to La Pérouse. This was the gist of what I relayed to Captain Nemo. So, he mused, the fate of the third vessel, built by the survivors on Vanikoro, remains a mystery? Yes, I affirmed. Captain Nemo said nothing, but beckoned me to follow him into the Grand Saloon. The Nautilus descended deeper, and the observation panels were opened. I rushed to the window, and beneath the coral incrustations teeming with sponges, sea squirts, soft corals, stony corals, and a myriad of colourful fish, wrasses, damselfish, grunts, aslets, and squirrelfish, I recognised debris the dredgers hadn't managed to retrieve. Iron stirrups, anchors, cannons, bullets, capstan fittings, even a ship's stem. These artifacts, now adorned with living flora, bore silent witness to a maritime disaster. As I gazed upon this desolate scene, Captain Nemo's voice, heavy with sorrow, broke the silence. Commander Lapérouse embarked on his voyage on December 7th, 1785, with his ships, the Beausoleil and the Astrolabe. His first stop was Botany Bay, followed by the Friendly Islands, New Caledonia. He then set course for Santa Cruz, landing at Namuka in the Ha'apai group. It was there that his ships met their fate on the uncharted reefs of Vanikoro. The Beausoleil struck first on the southern coast. The Astrolabe, attempting to assist, also ran aground. The first vessel was quickly destroyed. The second, battered by the elements, endured for several days. The natives welcomed the survivors, who established a settlement on the island and constructed a smaller boat from the wreckage. Some sailors chose to remain on Vanikoro, while others, weakened and ill, set sail with Lapérouse. They headed towards the Solomon Islands, where they perished, along with their makeshift vessel, on the western coast of the main island, somewhere between Cape Deception and Cape Satisfaction. "How can you be certain of this?" I asked, astonished. "Because I found this at the site of the final wreck." Captain Nemo presented a tin box bearing the French coat of arms, corroded by seawater. He opened it, revealing a bundle of yellowed but legible papers. They were the naval minister's instructions to Commander Lapérouse, annotated in the margins by Louis XVI himself. "A noble end for a sailor," Captain Nemo murmured. "A coral tomb is a peaceful grave. I hope my comrades and I will find no other." Chapter 19. Torres Straits. Tor. During the night of December 27th, the Nautilus departed from Vanikoro's shores at high speed. Heading southwest, she covered the 750 leagues to Lapérouse's archipelago and the southeastern tip of Papua New Guinea in a mere 3 days. Early on January 1st, 1868, Conseil joined me on deck. "Professor, may I wish you a happy new year?" "What's this, Conseil?" I chuckled, as if we were back in Paris, in my study at the Jardin des Plantes. "Well, I accept your well wishes and thank you for them. But tell me, what does Happy New Year mean under our current circumstances? Are you referring to the year that will see the end of our captivity, or the year that continues this extraordinary voyage?" Honestly, Professor, I don't know how to answer that. We're certainly seeing amazing things, and the past 2 months have been anything but dull. Each new wonder surpasses the last, and if this trend continues, who knows where it might lead? I doubt we'll ever experience anything like this again. So, with all due respect, Professor, perhaps a happy year would be one where we get to see everything. By January 2nd, we had travelled 11,340 miles, or 5,250 leagues, from our starting point in the Sea of Japan. Ahead lay the treacherous Coral Sea, off the northeastern coast of Australia. We were just a few miles from the infamous reef, where Cook's ship, the Endeavour, was damaged on June 10th, 1770. A piece of coral, broken off during the impact, had become wedged in the hull, preventing the ship from sinking. I had hoped to examine this 360-league-long reef, where the turbulent sea relentlessly pounded with thunderous force. However, the Nautilus diving planes angled us downwards into the depths, and I could only glimpse the coral's towering walls. I had to content myself with the diverse fish specimens collected in the nets. Among them were several large rainbow runners, a type of mackerel the size of tuna, with bluish sides and vertical stripes that fade upon death. These fish followed us in schools, providing us with delectable meals. We also captured numerous gilt-head sea bream, about 1.5 inches long, with a flavour similar to John Dory, and flying fish resembling underwater swallows, their bioluminescent glow illuminating the air and water on dark nights. Among the mollusks and other marine invertebrates, I found various species of soft corals, sea urchins, hammer oysters, Venus clams, sundial shells, keriths and hyaline shells. The flora included beautiful floating seaweed like kelp and oarweed, saturated with the mucilage they exude. I even collected a magnificent Nemastoma gilliniarois, a rare specimen worthy of a museum. 2 days after traversing the Coral Sea, on January 4th, we sighted the Papuan coastline. Captain Nemo informed me of his intention to reach the Indian Ocean via the Torres Strait, a perilous passage. The Torres Strait is roughly 34 leagues wide, but riddled with countless islands, islets, reefs, and rocks, making navigation a nightmare. Captain Nemo took every precaution to ensure a safe crossing. The Nautilus, floating between the surface and the depths, proceeded at a moderate pace, her propeller churning the waves like a whale's tail. Taking advantage of this pause, I and my companions ascended to the deserted platform. The helmsman's cabin was just ahead, and I assumed Captain Nemo was there, guiding the Nautilus through this treacherous passage. I had brought along detailed charts of the Torres Strait, which I now consulted meticulously. Around the Nautilus, the sea churned violently, waves surging from southeast to northwest at a speed of 2.5 miles per hour crashed against the exposed coral formations. "Nasty weather," Ned Land commented. "Indeed," I agreed, "and not ideal for a vessel like the Nautilus." "The captain must be incredibly confident in his navigation," Ned remarked. "I see coral outcroppings that could rip her hull to shreds with the slightest touch." The situation was undeniably precarious, but the Nautilus seemed to glide effortlessly past these hazards. She didn't follow the exact routes of the Astrolabe and Zelly, which had proved disastrous for Dumont d'Urville. Instead, she veered northward, skirting the Murray Islands, then turned southwest towards the Cumberland Passage. I thought she would bypass it, but then she turned northwest again, threading her way through a maze of little-known islands and islets towards the Endeavour Strait and Canal Mauvais. I wondered if Captain Nemo, in a reckless gamble, would attempt to steer through the same passage where Dumont d'Urville's ships had run aground. But he surprised me once more, abruptly changing course and heading due west towards Warrior Reef. By now, it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The tide, having reached its peak, began to recede. The Nautilus approached the reef, its distinctive fringe of screw pines still visible. We were about 2 miles away when a sudden jolt knocked me off my feet. The Nautilus had struck a rock and remained immobile, listing slightly to port. I scrambled to my feet and found Captain Nemo and his first mate on the platform, assessing the situation and exchanging words in their indecipherable language. This was our predicament. 2 miles to starboard lay Warrior Reef, stretching from north to west like a giant arm. To the south and east, exposed coral emerged as the tide ebbed. We were stranded in one of the regions where tides are moderate, a grim prospect for refloating the Nautilus. Fortunately, the vessel seemed undamaged, keel solidly intact, but unable to slide or maneuver. She risked being permanently trapped, spelling the end of Captain Nemo's underwater vessel. As I pondered our options, the captain, always composed and in control, approached me. "An accident?" I inquired. "No," he corrected, "an incident. But an incident that might force you to become a resident of the land you so fervently avoid?" Captain Nemo looked at me curiously and shook his head, indicating that nothing would compel him to set foot on solid ground again. "Besides, Monsieur Aronnax," he added, "the Nautilus isn't doomed. She will continue to transport you to the ocean's many marvels. Our journey has only just begun, and I wouldn't want to be deprived of your company so soon." "However, Captain Nemo," I replied, ignoring his subtle sarcasm, "the Nautilus is aground in the open sea. The Pacific tides aren't strong, and unless you can lighten the ship, I don't see how she'll be refloated." "The tides aren't strong in the Pacific. You're right about that, Professor," Captain Nemo conceded. "But in the Torres Strait, there's still a difference of 1.5 yards between high and low tide. Today is January 4th, and in 5 days, it will be a full moon. I'd be surprised if that celestial body didn't raise the water level enough to do me a favor." With that, he and his first mate descended back into the Nautilus. The vessel remained stuck, as if the coral polyps had already encased her in their unyielding cement. "Well, sir," Ned Land asked, joining me after the captain's departure. "Well, Ned, we'll patiently wait for the tide on the 9th. It seems the moon will be kind enough to grant us a reprieve." "Really? Really? And this captain isn't planning to drop anchor at all? He's relying solely on the tide?" Conseil inquired. The Canadian stared at Conseil, then shrugged. "Professor, trust me when I say this hunk of metal won't be sailing anywhere, above or below the water. It's only good for scrap now. I think it's time we bid Captain Nemo farewell." "Ned, my friend, I don't share your pessimism about the Nautilus. We'll know in 4 days what the Pacific tides have in store for us. Besides, escape might be feasible if we were near the English or French coast. But the Papuan shores are another matter. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, if the Nautilus doesn't refloat, which I consider a serious possibility." "But do they even know how to proceed cautiously?" Ned retorted. "There's an island out there with trees, and under those trees are land animals, the kind that provide steaks and roasts. I'd love to sample them." "Ned has a point," Conseil chimed in. "Professor, couldn't you ask your friend Captain Nemo for permission to go ashore, even if just to maintain our ability to walk on solid ground?" "I can ask," I replied, "but he'll likely refuse." "Will you take the chance, Professor?" Conseil persisted. "We could gauge the captain's goodwill." To my surprise, Captain Nemo granted my request with unexpected cheerfulness. He didn't even demand a promise to return to the ship. However, escaping through New Guinea could be perilous, and I wouldn't advise Ned to attempt it. Better to be a captive on the Nautilus than to fall into the hands of the natives. At 8 o'clock, armed with rifles and hatchets, we disembarked from the Nautilus. The sea was relatively calm, a gentle breeze blowing towards the shore. Conseil and I rowed swiftly, while Ned steered through the narrow channel formed by the breakers. The boat was expertly handled and made good time. Ned Land could barely contain his joy. He was like a prisoner who had escaped and hadn't yet realized the need to return. "Meat! We're going to feast on meat! And not just any meat," he exclaimed. "Real game, no more fish." "I'm not saying fish isn't good," I cautioned. "We shouldn't be ungrateful. A piece of fresh venison, grilled over an open fire, would be a welcome change." "You're making my mouth water," Conseil chimed in. "Let's hope these forests are teeming with game," I said, "and not the kind that hunts the hunter." "Well said, Professor," Ned replied, his teeth seemingly sharpening like the blade of his hatchet. "But I'll eat tiger loin, if there's no other four-legged creature on this island." "Ned's getting a little ahead of himself," Conseil observed. "Whatever it is," Ned continued, "any animal with 4 legs and no feathers, or 2 legs and no feathers, will be greeted with my first shot." "Here we go again," I sighed. "Master Land's recklessness knows no bounds." "Don't worry, Professor," Ned assured me. "It won't take me 25 minutes to whip up a meal you'll enjoy." At 8:30, the Nautilus's boat glided onto a sandy beach, having safely navigated the coral reef surrounding Warrior Reef. Chapter 20. A brief respite on land, so setting foot on solid ground again was exhilarating. Ned Land tested the soil with his boots, as if claiming it for himself. It had been only 2 months since we had become, according to Captain Nemo, passengers aboard the Nautilus, but in truth, we were his prisoners. Within minutes, we were within rifle range of the coastline. The horizon was concealed behind a breathtaking wall of jungle. Massive trees, their trunks soaring 200 feet high, were interwoven with vines, forming natural hammocks swaying gently in the breeze. Mimosas, figs, hibiscus, and palm trees grew in wild profusion, while orchids, legumes, and ferns thrived beneath their verdant canopy. Ignoring the beauty of the Papuan flora, the ever-practical Canadian focused on sustenance. He discovered a coconut tree, knocked down some fruit, cracked them open, and we savoured the milk and flesh with a satisfaction that spoke volumes about the Nautilus' monotonous fare. "Amazing," Ned declared. "Exquisite," Conseil echoed. And I doubt the captain would mind us bringing a load of coconuts back to the ship, Ned mused. Probably not, I replied, but he wouldn't eat them himself. All the better for us, Ned quipped. More to go around. Just a word of caution, Master Land, I addressed the harpooner, who was already eyeing another coconut tree. Coconuts are delicious, but before we overload the boat, wouldn't it be wise to explore and see if the island offers other useful provisions? Fresh vegetables would be a welcome addition to the Nautilus's galley. The professor is right, Conseil agreed. I propose we allocate 3 sections in the boat, 1 for fruit, 1 for vegetables, and the 3rd for the venison we have yet to encounter. Don't lose hope, Conseil, Ned encouraged him. Let's keep exploring, I suggested, and stay alert. Even though the island seems uninhabited, there might be people here who aren't as picky about their game as we are. Ned's jaw worked as he considered this. Ho ho, he exclaimed. What is it, Ned? Conseil asked. Well, I'm starting to see the appeal of cannibalism, Ned joked darkly. Ned, are you suggesting you'd eat a fellow human? I wouldn't feel safe sharing a cabin with you anymore. I might wake up one day to find myself half-eaten. Don't worry, Conseil, my friend, Ned reassured him. I'm quite fond of you, but not enough to eat you unnecessarily. I wouldn't put it past you, Conseil retorted. But enough of that. We absolutely must find some game to satisfy this carnivore, or else one day the professor will find only scraps of his servant left for dinner. As we chatted, we ventured deeper into the shadowed depths of the forest. For 2 hours, we scoured it in every direction. Luck was on our side. We discovered edible plants, including one of the most valuable tropical staples, providing us with a precious food source missing from our shipboard diet. I speak of the breadfruit tree, abundant on Warrior Reef. We focused on the seedless variety, known in Malaysia as Rima. Ned Land, a seasoned traveller, was familiar with these fruits. He had eaten them on many voyages and knew how to prepare them. The mere sight of them filled him with such excitement that he could no longer contain himself. Professor, Ned declared, I'll wither away if I don't get a taste of that breadfruit. By all means, Ned, I said, indulge yourself. We're here to experiment after all. Won't take long, he replied, already gathering kindling. He soon had a fire crackling merrily. Meanwhile, Conseil and I selected the choicest breadfruits. Some were not yet ripe, their thick skins concealing a white, fibrous flesh. Others, mostly yellow and gelatinous, were perfectly ripe for the picking. These fruits had no seeds. Conseil brought a dozen to Ned, who sliced them thickly and placed them on the coals, all the while proclaiming, You'll see, Professor, how delicious this bread is, especially after going so long without it. It's not even bread, he added, but a delicate pastry. Haven't you ever had it? No, Ned, I confessed. Well, prepare yourself for a real treat. If you don't come back for seconds, I'm not the king of harpooners. A few minutes later, the exposed sides of the fruit were perfectly roasted. The inside resembled a white paste, a soft crumb with a flavour reminiscent of artichoke. I had to admit, the bread was exceptional, and I savoured every bite. What time is it? Ned asked. At least 2 o'clock, Conseil replied. Time sure flies on solid ground, Ned sighed. Let's get going, Conseil suggested. We headed back into the forest, adding to our collection by raiding some cabbage palms. We harvested the hearts from the treetops, along with small beans I recognised as the abru, favoured by the Malays, and some high-quality yams. By the time we reached the boat, we were fully loaded. However, Ned deemed our provisions insufficient, but fate smiled upon us. As we were about to shove off, he spotted several 25 to 30-foot tall palm trees. Finally, at 5 o'clock, laden with our bounty, we pushed off from the shore. Half an hour later, we hailed the Nautilus. No one appeared to greet us. The massive iron vessel seemed deserted. After storing the provisions, I retired to my cabin and, following supper, slept soundly. The next morning, January 6th, there was no sign of activity on board. The boat remained undisturbed in the same spot where we had left it. We decided to return to the island. Ned was determined to have better luck with hunting and wanted to explore a different part of the forest. At dawn, we set off. The boat, propelled by the waves, reached the island in minutes. We disembarked and, acquiescing to the Canadian's wishes, followed Ned Land, whose long strides threatened to leave us behind. He led us west along the coast, then through several streams, reaching a high plateau bordered by magnificent forests. Kingfishers flitted along the waterways but kept their distance. Their wariness suggested they knew what to expect from our kind, leading me to believe that while the island might be uninhabited, it was occasionally visited by humans. After crossing a sizable meadow, we arrived at the edge of a small wood filled with the songs and fluttering of numerous birds. "Only birds here," Conseil noted. "But they're edible," the harpooner countered. "I disagree, Ned," Conseil said. "I only see parrots." "My friend," Ned replied with mock solemnity, "when you have nothing else, parrot is as good as pheasant. And," I added, "when properly prepared, this bird is quite palatable." Beneath the dense canopy, a vibrant world of parrots flitted from branch to branch, their chattering a symphony of colours. Solemn cockatoos, seemingly pondering philosophical questions, shared their space with brilliant red lories that flashed through the foliage, like scraps of crimson cloth carried on the breeze. Azure-hued Papuan lorikeets added to the kaleidoscope of winged wonders, a spectacle to behold, but not exactly a feast for hungry hunters. However, one bird unique to this region, found nowhere else but the Aru and Papuan Islands, was absent from this avian gathering. But fate, it seemed, had a surprise in store for us. After traversing a relatively dense grove, we emerged into a clearing dotted with shrubs. There, I saw them, magnificent birds whose elongated feathers forced them to fly against the wind. Their graceful, undulating flight, their elegant aerial maneuvers, and the shimmering iridescence of their plumage captivated the eye. "Birds of paradise," I exclaimed. "The Malays, who conduct a brisk trade in these birds with the Chinese, have various methods for capturing them, none of which were available to us. They sometimes set traps atop tall trees, favoured by the birds of paradise, or snare them with sticky sap that immobilizes them. They even resort to poisoning the birds' watering holes. We, on the other hand, had to rely on shooting them mid-flight, a strategy with slim chances of success. Indeed, we quickly expended half our ammunition to no avail. By 11 in the morning, we had crossed the first mountain range at the island's centre, our game bags empty. Hunger gnawed at us. The hunters had banked on the spoils of the hunt, and their gamble had failed. Fortunately, Conseil, to his astonishment, scored a double with a single shot, securing our breakfast. He bagged a white pigeon and a wood pigeon, which, skillfully plucked and skewered, was soon roasting over a crackling fire of dry wood. While the birds cooked, Ned prepared the breadfruit. We devoured the wood pigeons, bones and all, and they were delicious. The nutmeg they habitually consume infused their flesh with a delightful flavour. "Well, Ned, what are you missing now?" I asked. "Some four-legged game, Professor. These pigeons are mere appetizers. I won't be satisfied until I've bagged an animal with some decent meat on its bones." "Same here, Ned," I added. "I won't be content until I've captured a bird of paradise." "Let's continue hunting then," Conseil urged. "Let's head towards the coast. We've reached the foothills, and I think returning to the forest would be wise." His suggestion was sensible, and we followed it. After an hour's walk, we found ourselves in a grove of sago palms. Harmless snakes slithered away from us. The birds of paradise eluded our approach, and I was beginning to lose hope when Conseil, who was leading the way, suddenly crouched down with a triumphant cry. He returned with a magnificent specimen in hand. "Bravo, Conseil!" I exclaimed. "You're too kind, Professor." "Not at all, my boy. That was an excellent shot. Take this magnificent bird and hold it carefully. If you examine it closely, Professor, you'll see that I hardly deserve any credit." "Why is that, Conseil?" Because this bird is as drunk as a skunk. Drunk? Indeed, Professor. Drunk on the nutmegs it devoured under the tree where I found it. See, Ned? Witness the devastating effects of overindulgence. Professor, Ned declared, I'll be a grumpy Gus if I don't get a taste of that breadfruit pie. By all means, Ned, indulge yourself, I chuckled. We're here for scientific exploration, so experiment away. It won't be long, he assured me. Using a lens, he ignited a fire with dry wood, and soon flames crackled merrily. Conseil and I, meanwhile, selected the ripest breadfruits. Ned, armed with a dozen sliced breadfruits, expertly roasted them over the coals, declaring, You'll see, Professor, this bread is the best thing since sliced, well, bread. Especially when you haven't had any in a while. It's more like a delicious pastry. Ever tried it? No, Ned, I admitted. Well, get ready for a taste explosion. If you don't come back for seconds, I'll renounce my title as harpooning champion. Within minutes, the exposed portions were perfectly browned. The interior resembled a creamy paste, a soft crumb with a flavour reminiscent of artichoke. I must confess, it was truly exceptional. What time is it? Ned asked between bites. At least 2 o'clock, Conseil replied. Time flies when you're on terra firma, Ned sighed. Let's head back, Conseil suggested. We returned to the forest, adding to our haul by raiding some cabbage palms for their hearts, along with some small beans I recognised as the Malay abru, and a stash of top-notch yams. By the time we reached the boat, we were weighed down with our bounty, yet Ned remained unsatisfied. But luck was on our side. As we prepared to shove off, he spotted several palm trees, standing 25 to 30 feet tall. Finally, at 5 o'clock, laden with our treasures, we departed the island. Half an hour later, we hailed the Nautilus. No one responded. The massive iron vessel appeared deserted. After stowing the provisions, I retired to my cabin, enjoying a satisfying dinner and a sound sleep. The next morning, January 6th, there was still no sign of activity on board. The dinghy remained undisturbed. We decided to return to the island, with Ned hoping for better luck with his hunting in a different part of the forest. At dawn, we set out, the waves carrying us swiftly to shore. We landed and, yielding to the Canadian's enthusiasm, followed Ned as he loped along the coast westward. He crossed several streams, leading us to a high plateau fringed with magnificent forests. Kingfishers darted along the waterways, wary of our approach. Their caution suggested they were familiar with humans, confirming my suspicion that while the island may be uninhabited, it did see occasional visitors. After crossing a vast meadow, we arrived at the edge of a small wood teeming with birdsong and fluttering wings. Only birds here, Conseil observed. Edible birds, Ned countered. I disagree, my friend, Conseil said. I see only parrots. Conseil, Ned declared with feigned gravity. When you have nothing else, parrot is practically gourmet. And, I added, properly prepared, it can be quite tasty. A cacophony of calls erupted from the dense foliage as a vibrant array of parrots took flight, their colours flashing amidst the greenery. Chapter 21. Captain Nemo's Thunderbolt. We crouched at the forest's edge, my hand frozen mid-motion towards my mouth, while Ned Land finished chewing. Rocks don't just fall from the sky, Conseil remarked dryly, or else we'd call them meteorites. A second rock, clearly aimed, knocked a tasty pigeon leg from Conseil's hand, adding weight to his observation. We scrambled to our feet, shouldering our rifles, ready to retaliate. Are those monkeys? Ned blurted. Close, I said, but they're savages. To the boat, I urged, sprinting towards the shore. Retreat was indeed necessary. About 20 natives, armed with bows and slings, emerged from the undergrowth that marked the horizon to our right, barely 100 yards away. Our boat was moored 60 feet from us. The savages advanced, not running but displaying clear aggression. Stones and arrows rained down on us. Despite the danger, Ned was reluctant to abandon our provisions. With his pig in one hand and kangaroos in the other, he moved surprisingly fast. Within 2 minutes, we reached the shore. We loaded the boat with our supplies and weapons, shoved it into the water, and quickly got the oars in place. We hadn't even gone 200 yards when a horde of savages, whooping and gesturing wildly, charged into the water up to their waists. I scanned the Nautilus, hoping her crew would be alerted to our predicament, but the massive vessel remained silent and deserted. 20 minutes later, we were back on board. The hatches were open, and we secured the boat and hurried inside. I descended to the lounge where I heard music playing. Captain Nemo was there, hunched over his organ, lost in a musical trance. "Captain!" He didn't hear me. "Captain!" I repeated, touching his hand. He jolted, then turned. "Ah, Professor, back already? Did you have a successful hunt? Were your botanical endeavours fruitful?" "Yes, Captain. But unfortunately, we've attracted a group of bipeds whose presence is somewhat unsettling." "What bipeds?" "Savages. Savages," he echoed with a sardonic chuckle. "You're surprised, Professor, to find savages after setting foot on an unknown land? Savages are everywhere, and are they any worse than the so-called civilized folk? But Captain, how many did you encounter?" "At least 100. Pierre Aronnax," Nemo replied, his fingers dancing across the organ keys. "Even if every native on Papua were gathered on this shore, the Nautilus would have nothing to fear from their attacks." I noticed that the captain played only the black keys, giving his melodies a distinctly Scottish feel. Soon, he seemed to forget my presence. Lost in a reverie I didn't dare disturb. I returned to the deck. Night had fallen, for in these low latitudes, the sun sets quickly, without twilight. The island was barely visible, but numerous fires dotted the beach, indicating the natives had no intention of leaving. I spent several hours alone, pondering the natives, not with fear, for the captain's unshakable confidence was infectious, and admiring the tropical night sky. My thoughts drifted to France, following the constellations that would soon grace the heavens. The moon shone brightly among the stars. The night passed without incident. The islanders, likely intimidated by the sight of a monstrous vessel grounded in the bay, had kept their distance. The hatches remained open, offering easy access to the Nautilus's interior. At 6 o'clock on the morning of January 8th, I returned to the deck. Dawn was breaking, and the island gradually emerged from the dissipating mist. First the shore, then the peaks. The following day, the shore was teeming with natives, 500 or 600 perhaps. Some, taking advantage of the low tide, had ventured onto the coral reef, barely 200 yards from the Nautilus. They were easily identifiable as Papuans, with their athletic builds, strong features, high foreheads, and bright white teeth. Their reddish-tinged, woolly hair contrasted sharply with their dark, gleaming skin. Ornate bone necklaces hung from their elongated earlobes. Most were naked, save for a few women adorned with grass skirts and belts made of plant fibers. Some chiefs wore crescent-shaped ornaments and necklaces of red and white glass beads. Nearly all were armed with bows, arrows, and shields, and carried nets filled with round stones, expertly hurled from slings. One of the chiefs, standing near the Nautilus, studied the vessel intently. He was likely a high-ranking Mardo, draped in a fringed mat of banana leaves adorned with bright colours. I could have easily picked off this native with my rifle, but I deemed it prudent to await overt hostility. In encounters between Europeans and indigenous people, it's wiser to defend than to initiate aggression. During low tide, the natives roamed near the Nautilus, but remained peaceful. I often heard them repeat the word "asai," their gestures indicating an invitation to come ashore, which I politely declined. Thus, we didn't venture out that day, much to Ned Land's disappointment, as he couldn't replenish our provisions. The resourceful Canadian busied himself preparing the food he had already gathered. Meanwhile, the natives retreated to the shore around 11 o'clock as the rising tide submerged the coral. Their numbers, however, had swelled considerably. They likely hailed from neighbouring islands or even Papua New Guinea. Interestingly, I hadn't seen a single native canoe. With nothing better to do, I decided to trawl these clear, inviting waters, which teemed with shells, marine life, and plants. This would be our last day in this area. As Captain Nemo had promised we would be back in open water by the next morning, I called for Conseil, who brought me a small dredge net similar to those used for oyster harvesting. We got to work. For 2 hours, we tirelessly combed the seabed, but nothing extraordinary turned up. The net was filled with abalone, harp shells, melon shells, and the most stunning hammer oysters I'd ever seen. We also collected a few sea slugs, pearl oysters, and a dozen small turtles destined for the ship's pantry. Just when I least expected it, I stumbled upon a treasure, a natural anomaly rarely encountered. Conseil was hauling in the net, laden with ordinary shells, when he saw me suddenly plunge my arm in and heard me cry out. "What's wrong, Professor?" he asked, alarmed. "Did something bite you?" "No, my boy, but I'd gladly sacrifice a finger for this find." "What did you find?" "This shell," I said, holding up my prize. "It's just an olive shell, genus Oliva, family Olividae, class Gastropoda, subclass Mollusca." "Yes, Conseil," I corrected. "But instead of coiling to the right, this olive shell spirals to the left." "That's incredible!" "Indeed, my boy. It's a left-handed shell." Shells typically coil to the right, with rare exceptions. When a left-handed specimen is found, collectors will pay a king's ransom for it. Conseil and I were captivated by our treasure, and I was already envisioning it displayed in a museum when a stone, carelessly flung by a native, struck the shell in Conseil's hand, shattering it. I cried out in despair. Conseil raised his rifle, aiming at a savage who was readying his sling, barely 10 yards away. I tried to stop him, but he fired, hitting the savage's arm and shattering his amulet bracelet. "Conseil!" I shouted. "Professor," he replied. "Don't you see that the cannibal has initiated an attack? A shell isn't worth a man's life," I reminded him. "The nerve of that savage," Conseil fumed. "I'd rather he had broken my arm." While Conseil was genuinely upset, I didn't share his sentiment. Unbeknownst to us, the situation had escalated. A fleet of canoes now encircled the Nautilus. These long, narrow vessels, carved from tree trunks and balanced by bamboo outriggers, were built for speed. They were manned by skilled, half-naked paddlers, and their approach filled me with unease. It was clear these Papuans had encountered Europeans before and recognized our ship. But what could they make of this long iron cylinder resting in their bay, devoid of masts or smokestacks? Nothing good, I presumed, as they initially kept their distance. However, seeing the Nautilus motionless, they gradually grew bolder, attempting to close in. This familiarity was precisely what we needed to avoid. Our silent weapons would have limited impact on these savages, who respected only brute force. A lightning strike without thunder wouldn't intimidate them, even though the true danger lies in the electricity, not the noise. Suddenly, the canoes surged towards the Nautilus, and a volley of arrows rained down upon her hull. I rushed to the saloon, but it was empty. I cautiously knocked on the door to the captain's quarters. "Enter!" a voice commanded. Inside, I found Captain Nemo engrossed in complex algebraic equations. "I apologize for the interruption," I said politely. "Quite all right, Monsieur Aronnax," he replied. "But I presume you have a pressing reason for seeking me out." "A very serious one. The natives are swarming around us in canoes, and within minutes, we'll surely be under attack by hundreds of them." "Ah," Nemo said calmly. "They've arrived in their canoes, have they?" "Yes, sir." "Well then, we must secure the hatches." "Exactly. I came to inform you." "Nothing could be simpler," Nemo interrupted, pressing a button to relay the order to his crew. "It's done," he announced moments later. "The hatches are sealed, and the skiff is prepared. I trust you don't believe these men could breach walls that withstood your frigate's cannon fire." "No, Captain, but there remains a risk." "And what is that?" Tomorrow, at approximately this time, we'll need to open the hatches to replenish the Nautilus air supply. If the Papuans are still on the platform, I don't see how you could prevent them from boarding. So you anticipate they'll attempt to board us? I'm certain of it. Then let them come, Nemo said with an air of indifference. I see no reason to stop them. After all, these Papuans are simple people, and I wouldn't want my visit to their island to cost a single life. I was about to leave, but the captain gestured for me to stay and sit beside him. He inquired with genuine interest about our excursions on the island and our hunting adventures, though he seemed perplexed by Ned's insatiable craving for meat. We then discussed various topics, and while he remained tight-lipped about certain matters, Captain Nemo showed a more affable side. Our conversation drifted to the Nautilus's grounding, ironically in the same strait where Dumont d'Urville nearly met his demise. D'Urville was one of your finest seamen, Nemo remarked. One of your most brilliant navigators. He's the French equivalent of Captain Cook. It's a tragic irony that a man of such vigour, after braving the Antarctic icebergs, the coral reefs of Oceania, and the cannibals of the Pacific, should perish in a train accident. If he could have contemplated his life in those final moments, what do you suppose would have occupied his thoughts? As he spoke, Captain Nemo appeared genuinely moved, and his emotion made me view him in a more favourable light. We then examined a chart, retracing the French explorer's voyages, his circumnavigation attempts, his 2 expeditions to the South Pole, which resulted in the discovery of Adélie Land and Terre Louis-Philippe, and his charting of major Pacific islands. What your d'Urville achieved on the surface of the seas, Captain Nemo declared, I have accomplished beneath them with greater ease and thoroughness. The Astrolabe and the Zélie, constantly battered by storms, couldn't compare to the Nautilus, a tranquil haven of scientific endeavour, truly motionless in the heart of the ocean. Tomorrow, the captain announced, rising. At 20 minutes to 3 in the afternoon, the Nautilus will be afloat and safely out of the Torres Strait. With a curt nod, Captain Nemo dismissed me, and I returned to my quarters. Conseil was eager to know the outcome of my conversation. My boy, I said. When I expressed concern about the Papuans threatening the Nautilus, the captain responded with sarcasm. I have only this to say. Trust him and sleep soundly. Do you not need my assistance, Professor? No, my friend. What is Ned Land up to? If you'll excuse me, sir, Conseil replied. Ned is busy preparing a kangaroo pie that will surely be a culinary masterpiece. I was left alone with my thoughts and turned in for the night, but sleep evaded me. The clamour of the savages, stomping on the deck and yelling incessantly, filled the air. Yet, the crew slept undisturbed. The presence of these cannibals affected them no more than ants crawling over a fortified bunker would bother soldiers within. At 6 in the morning, I rose. The hatches remained sealed, stale air unreplenished. Instead, the ship's emergency oxygen reserves were tapped, injecting several cubic feet of oxygen into the Nautilus' depleted atmosphere. I worked in my room until noon, without a glimpse of Captain Nemo. There were no visible preparations for departure. I waited a while longer, then went to the lounge. The clock read 2:30. High tide would arrive in 10 minutes, and if Captain Nemo had not made an empty promise, the Nautilus would soon be freed. Otherwise, we could be trapped here for months. I felt the first vibrations as the ship's keel scraped against the rough, coral-encrusted seabed. At 2:55, Captain Nemo appeared in the lounge. We are about to depart, he declared. Ah, I replied. I've given the order to open the hatches. And the Papuans? The Papuans? Nemo echoed, a hint of amusement in his voice. Won't they try to come aboard? How? By simply jumping through the open hatches. Mere Aronnax, Nemo said calmly. They will not enter the Nautilus that way, even if the hatches were wide open. I looked at him puzzled. You don't understand, he asked. Not entirely. Come and see for yourself. I followed him to the central staircase, where Ned and Conseil were discreetly observing the crew opening the hatches. The air was filled with enraged cries and terrified screams from outside. The exterior hatch covers were lowered. 20 menacing faces appeared. The first native to reach for the handrail was suddenly repelled by an unseen force, tumbling backward with a blood-curdling scream. 10 of his companions followed, each meeting the same fate. Conseil was ecstatic. Ned, driven by instinct, lunged towards the stairs, but the moment he grabbed the handrail, he too was thrown back. "I've been hit by lightning," he shouted, swearing profusely. It all became clear. The handrail was not what it seemed, but an electrified metal cable connected to the deck and platform. Anyone who touched it received a powerful shock, a shock that would have been fatal had Captain Nemo released the full force of the current. He had, in essence, created an impenetrable electric barrier between himself and his attackers. The stunned Papuans retreated in terror. Meanwhile, we chuckled as we helped the bewildered Ned land to his feet, who continued to curse vehemently. At that precise moment, lifted by the rising tide, the Nautilus broke free from the coral reef, exactly 40 minutes after the captain's prediction. Her propeller churned the water slowly, then with increasing power. We glided along the surface, leaving the treacherous Torres Strait behind us safe and sound. Chapter 22, Nightmares of the Deep. On the 10th of January, the Nautilus continued its journey between two seas at an astonishing pace. I estimated at least 35 miles per hour. The propeller churned so rapidly that I couldn't track its rotations. When I considered the wonders of this electric force, providing propulsion, heat, and light for the Nautilus, and even shielding her from external threats with an electrifying touch, my admiration for the vessel and her creator knew no bounds. Our course was westward, and on January 11th, we rounded Cape Vessel, situated at 135 degrees longitude and 10 degrees south latitude, easternmost point of the Gulf of Carpentaria. Though numerous, the reefs were more evenly distributed and marked with precision on our charts. The Nautilus deftly avoided the Money Shoal to port and the Victoria Reefs to starboard, adhering to the 10th parallel. On January 13th, Captain Nemo entered the Timor Sea and identified the island of Timor at 122 degrees longitude. From this point, the Nautilus turned southwest. Her bow pointed towards the Indian Ocean. Where would Captain Nemo's whims lead us next? Back to the Asian coast? Or perhaps a return to European shores? Both seemed improbable for a man who shunned inhabited lands. Would he venture south, rounding the Cape of Good Hope and Cape Horn, ultimately reaching the Antarctic Pole? Or would he return to the Pacific, where his Nautilus could roam freely? Only time would tell. After skirting the sandbars of Cartier, Hibernia, Seringapatam, and Scott, the last vestiges of land, on January 14th, we lost sight of terra firma altogether. The Nautilus slowed considerably, her course erratic, sometimes submerged, sometimes floating on the surface. During this phase of the voyage, Captain Nemo conducted fascinating experiments on the varying temperatures of the ocean at different depths. Typically, such observations are made with complex instruments and unreliable thermometer probes, often shattered by the immense pressure. The resulting data is often inaccurate. However, Captain Nemo personally descended to measure the temperatures, his thermometer, linked to various sensors, providing instant and precise readings. By adjusting ballast or maneuvering with the diving planes, the Nautilus reached depths of 3, 4, 5, 7, 9, and 10,000 yards. The unequivocal conclusion of these tests was that the sea maintained a consistent average temperature of 4.5 degrees Celsius at depths of 5,000 fathoms, regardless of latitude. On January 16th, the Nautilus seemed to idle just beneath the waves. Her electrical systems were inactive, and the motionless propeller left her adrift. I assumed the crew was busy with internal repairs necessitated by the vessel's strenuous maneuvers. My companions and I then witnessed a peculiar sight. The lounge hatches were open, and with the Nautilus beacon deactivated, a dim gloom permeated the surrounding waters. I observed the ocean in this subdued light, the largest fish appearing as mere shadows. Suddenly, the Nautilus was bathed in bright light. I initially assumed the beacon had been activated, casting its electric beam into the depths, but I was mistaken. After a quick scan of our surroundings, the true source of the light became chillingly clear. The Nautilus drifted through a phosphorescent field, the glow so intense in the darkness that it was almost blinding. It emanated from countless bioluminescent organisms, their brilliance amplified as they danced across the vessel's metallic hull. Flashes of lightning illuminated the luminous sheets, resembling molten lead or white-hot metal. The stark contrast created pockets of shadow amidst the fiery glow, where darkness seemed impossible. This was no ordinary, serene lightning. It pulsed with an unusual energy, a living light. In reality, it was a vast swarm of iridescent microorganisms, tiny gelatinous spheres with thread-like tentacles. In a mere 2 cubic half-inches of water, scientists had counted as many as 25,000 of these creatures. For hours, the Nautilus sailed through these radiant waves, our awe growing as we watched the marine creatures frolicking like mythical salamanders. In this mesmerizing underwater fireworks display, I saw the swift, graceful porpoises, the tireless clowns of the ocean, and swordfish 10 feet long, those ominous heralds of storms, their formidable swords occasionally striking the saloon's glass windows. Smaller fish, like triggerfish, pompanos, surgeonfish, and countless others, streaked through the luminous water. This dazzling spectacle was utterly captivating. Perhaps some atmospheric condition had intensified the phenomenon, or perhaps a storm raged on the surface. But at our depth, the Nautilus remained undisturbed, resting peacefully in tranquil waters. Our journey continued, each day bringing new marvels. Time seemed to slip by unnoticed. Ned, as always, sought to diversify our onboard diet. Like snails, we were confined to our shells, and I must admit, the snail's life wasn't so bad. This existence felt almost normal, and thoughts of life on land faded. But an unexpected event jarred us back to the reality of our extraordinary situation. On January 18th, the Nautilus was at 105 degrees longitude and 15 degrees south latitude. The weather had turned ominous, the sea rough and turbulent. A strong easterly wind whipped up the waves. The barometer, which had been falling for days, signaled an approaching storm. I went up on deck as the first mate was measuring the hourly angles, waiting for his customary cryptic announcement. But today, it was replaced by a different, equally baffling phrase. Almost immediately, Captain Nemo emerged, telescope in hand, scanning the horizon. He stood motionless for several minutes, his gaze fixed on a distant point. Then, he lowered the telescope and exchanged a few words with his first mate. The latter seemed agitated, struggling to contain his emotions. Captain Nemo, however, remained calm, even as he appeared to raise objections to something the first mate was saying. Their differing tones and gestures suggested a tense exchange. I peered intently in the direction they were focused on, but saw nothing. The sky and sea merged seamlessly at the horizon. Captain Nemo paced the deck, not acknowledging me, perhaps not even seeing me. His stride was purposeful, but less steady than usual. Occasionally, he'd pause, arms crossed, and stare out at the sea. What could he possibly be searching for in this vast expanse? The nearest coastline was hundreds of miles away. The first mate, his agitation growing, continued to scrutinize the horizon with the telescope, pacing back and forth and stamping his feet. The mystery clearly needed to be resolved soon, for Captain Nemo ordered the engine to increase power, accelerating the propeller's rotation. The first mate again drew the captain's attention to something in the distance. Nemo stopped his restless pacing and raised his telescope. He observed for a long time. Intrigued and puzzled, I descended to the lounge and retrieved my own high-powered telescope. Leaning against the lantern housing, I scanned the horizon, searching for the source of their concern. No sooner had I raised the telescope to my eye than it was snatched from my grasp. I turned to find Captain Nemo standing before me, his features contorted in a mask of fury. His eyes blazed, his teeth clenched, his body rigid, fists clenched, and head drawn between his shoulders. He was a portrait of barely contained rage, frozen in place. My telescope, ripped from his hand, lay at his feet. Had I unknowingly triggered this outburst? Did this enigmatic man believe I had stumbled upon some forbidden secret? No, I wasn't the target of his wrath, for he wasn't even looking at me. His gaze was fixated on some unseen point on the horizon. Finally, Captain Nemo regained his composure. His anger subsided as he spoke a few words in a foreign tongue to his first mate, then turned to me. "Monsieur Aronnax," he said, his voice sharp and commanding, "I must insist you abide by one of the conditions you agreed to upon boarding my vessel." "What is it, Captain?" "You and your companions must remain confined to your quarters until I deem it appropriate to release you." "As you wish, Captain," I replied, meeting his gaze. "But may I ask why?" "No, sir." There was no arguing with his imperious tone. Resistance would have been futile. I went to the cabin shared by Ned Land and Conseil, informing them of the captain's decision. You can imagine the Canadians' reaction, but there was no time for protest. 4 crewmen stood at the door, ready to escort us to the same cell where we had spent our first night on the Nautilus. Ned started to object, but the door slammed shut before he could finish his sentence. "Professor, what does this mean?" Conseil asked, bewildered. I explained the situation, and my companions were as shocked and confused as I was. Lost in thought, I could only dwell on the inexplicable fear that had contorted the captain's face. I couldn't fathom its cause. My contemplation was interrupted by Ned Land's voice. "Hey, breakfast is ready." Indeed, the table was set. Captain Nemo must have given the order simultaneously with increasing the Nautilus' speed. "Professor, may I suggest something?" Conseil inquired. "Of course, my boy. I recommend we eat. It's wise, as we don't know what might happen next." "Good idea, Conseil. Pity they only gave us the usual ship fare," Ned grumbled. "Ned," Conseil retorted, "what would you have said if they had forgotten breakfast altogether?" That shut the harpooner up. We sat down to eat in silence. Suddenly, the luminous orb illuminating our cell flickered out, plunging us into darkness. Ned Land quickly fell asleep, and to my surprise, Conseil soon followed. I wondered what could have caused their sudden drowsiness when a wave of dizziness washed over me. Despite my efforts to stay awake, my eyes drooped shut. A horrifying suspicion took hold. They must have drugged our food. Imprisonment alone wasn't enough to conceal Captain Nemo's intentions. He needed us unconscious. I heard the panels slide shut. The gentle rocking of the waves ceased. The Nautilus submerged, returned to the still depths. I fought to resist sleep, but it was futile. My breath grew shallow. A deathly chill enveloped my stiffening limbs. My eyelids felt like lead weights, sealing my eyes shut. I was powerless to open them. A strange, hallucinatory slumber stole over me. Then, the visions faded, leaving me in complete oblivion. Chapter 23. The Coral Kingdom. The next morning, January 9th. I awoke feeling strangely refreshed, finding myself back in my own cabin. My companions had also been returned to their quarters, none of us aware of how or when it happened. We were clueless about the events of the previous night, and I could only hope the future would unravel this mystery. I left my room, wondering if I was free or still a prisoner. The door opened easily, and I made my way to the central staircase. Finding the hatches that were closed the night before now open, I stepped onto the platform. Ned Land and Conseil were waiting, equally bewildered. They had slept soundly, completely oblivious to their relocation. The Nautilus, as always, remained silent and enigmatic, floating on the surface at a leisurely pace. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. The first mate soon emerged and issued the standard orders. Captain Nemo was nowhere to be seen. The only crew member I encountered was the taciturn steward, who served me with his usual robotic efficiency. Around 2 o'clock, I was in the lounge. organising my notes, when the captain entered. I nodded in greeting, and he returned a slight bow, remaining silent. I resumed my work, hoping he might shed some light on the previous night's events. He didn't. He appeared exhausted, his eyes heavy and bloodshot, his face etched with sorrow. He paced restlessly, occasionally sitting then rising again, picking up random books only to discard them, consulting his instruments without his usual meticulous notes. He seemed troubled and agitated. Finally, he approached me and asked, "Are you a physician, Miss Aronnax?" The question was so unexpected that I stared at him for a moment, speechless. "Are you a physician?" he repeated. "Several of your colleagues have pursued medical studies." "Yes," I confirmed. "I am a physician and a hospital surgeon. I practiced for several years before joining the museum." "Very well, sir." My answer seemed to satisfy him, but unsure of what he intended to say next, I waited for further questions, ready to adapt my responses as needed. "Mer Aronnax," he asked, "would you be willing to examine one of my men?" "Is he ill?" "Yes. I'm ready to accompany you." I admit my heart pounded, though I couldn't say why. I sensed a connection between the crewman's illness and the previous night's events, and this mystery intrigued me as much as the patient himself. Captain Nemo led me to the stern of the Nautilus, into a cabin near the crew's quarters. There, lying in a bunk, was a man of about 40, with a determined expression, a typical Anglo-Saxon. I leaned over him. He was not only ill but injured. His head, wrapped in blood-soaked bandages, rested on a pillow. I carefully unwrapped the bandages, and the wounded man met my gaze with wide eyes, showing no signs of pain. The wound was horrific. His skull, shattered by some unknown weapon, exposed his severely damaged brain. Blood clots, the colour of wine dregs, had formed in the bruised and broken tissue. He had suffered both a concussion and a brain hemorrhage. His breathing was laboured, and his face twitched with muscle spasms. I checked his pulse. It was erratic. His extremities were already growing cold. Death was imminent. After cleaning and dressing the man's wounds, I reapplied the bandages and turned to Captain Nemo. "What caused this injury?" I asked. "What does it matter?" he replied, evasive. "A lever from the engine malfunctioned and struck him, and me as well. But what is your prognosis?" I hesitated, unsure if I should voice my concerns. "Speak freely," the captain urged. "This man doesn't understand French." I took one last look at the wounded crewman. "He won't last 2 hours," I said gravely. "Can nothing be done to save him?" "Nothing." Captain Nemo's hand clenched, and tears glistened in his eyes. Eyes I had thought incapable of such emotion. For a few moments, I watched as the life drained from the dying man. His face grew paler under the electric light that bathed his deathbed. I studied his intelligent brow, furrowed with lines of hardship and sorrow. I tried to decipher the secrets of his life from the final words that escaped his lips. "You may go now, Miss Aronnax," the captain said softly. I left him with his dying crewman and returned to my cabin, deeply affected by the scene. Unease plagued me throughout the day, and at night I slept fitfully, haunted by the sound of distant sighs that resembled a mournful hymn in an unfamiliar language. Were they the whispers of the dead? The next morning, I went to the deck. Captain Nemo was already there. He approached me as soon as he saw me. "Professor," he said, "would you be interested in joining me on another underwater excursion today?" "With my companions?" I asked. "If they wish." "We are at your disposal, Captain. Please put on your diving suits then." This was no morbid request. I relayed the invitation to Ned and Conseil, who eagerly agreed. Even Ned seemed enthusiastic about this new adventure. It was 8 a.m. By 8:30, we were equipped for the dive, each with a light and breathing apparatus. The double doors opened, and led by Captain Nemo and a dozen crew members, we stepped onto the solid seafloor, about 30 feet below the surface. A gentle slope led to an uneven bottom at 50 feet. This terrain was vastly different from the one I had explored on my first dive in the Pacific. There was no fine sand, no underwater meadows, no seaweed forests. I immediately recognized this extraordinary place where the captain had previously entertained us. We were in the heart of the coral kingdom. Light played in 1,000 mesmerizing patterns among the vibrantly colored branches. I could see the delicate tubular forms of the coral quivering in the water's gentle flow. I longed to touch their soft petals, adorned with delicate tentacles, some freshly bloomed, others still budding, while small fish darted among them like a flock of birds. But when my hand neared these living flowers, this sentient, animated garden, the entire colony recoiled. The white petals retreated into their red sheaths, the blossoms vanished before my eyes, and the vibrant coral transformed into a mass of stony knobs. By pure chance, I had stumbled upon the most precious specimens of this marine life. This coral was far more valuable than any found in the Mediterranean, off the coasts of France, Italy, or Barbary. Its hues justified the poetic names given to its most exquisite varieties. Flower of blood and froth of blood. Coral sold for a hefty price, £20 per ounce, and the underwater beds here could make a fortune for any coral diver. This prized material, often mistaken for other polyps, formed the intricate formations known as macleota, among which I spotted several beautiful examples of pink coral. As we continued, the coral formations grew denser and more elaborate. We were surrounded by veritable petrified thickets, long stretches of fantastical architecture. Captain Nemo guided us into a dark tunnel, descending a gentle slope to a depth of 300 feet. The beams from our lamps created an enchanting spectacle, tracing the rugged contours of natural arches and pendants, illuminating them with points of light like underwater chandeliers. After 2 hours of walking, we reached a depth of roughly 300 yards, the threshold where coral begins to thrive. But there were no mere shrubs or undergrowth here, nor were there solitary trees. This was a vast forest of massive mineral structures, immense petrified trees intertwined with delicate garlands of sea fan coral, all shimmering with iridescent reflections. We moved freely beneath their towering branches, lost in the watery shade. Suddenly, Captain Nemo stopped. My companions and I halted as well, and turning around, I saw his crew forming a semicircle around their leader. I watched intently as 4 of them carried a long, rectangular object on their shoulders. We found ourselves in the center of a large clearing, surrounded by the towering foliage of the underwater forest. Our lamps cast an ethereal glow, stretching the shadows on the seafloor. At the far end of the clearing, the darkness deepened, punctuated only by the twinkling reflections from the tips of coral. Ned Land and Conseil stood beside me, and we watched, anticipating an extraordinary scene. Examining the ground, I noticed small, raised areas encrusted with limestone deposits, arranged in a pattern that suggested human intervention. In the middle of the clearing, atop a crude pedestal of rocks, stood a cross made of coral, its long arms seemingly fashioned from petrified blood. At a signal from Captain Nemo, one of the men stepped forward and began digging a hole with a pickaxe retrieved from his belt. The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. This clearing was a graveyard, this hole a tomb, and that rectangular object the body of the man who had died during the night. The captain and his crew had come to bury their comrade in this secluded resting place at the bottom of this unreachable ocean. The grave was dug slowly, the fish scattering as their sanctuary was disturbed. The metallic clang of the pickaxe echoed through the water as it struck flint embedded in the seabed. Soon, the hole was deep and wide enough to accommodate the body. The bearers approached, and the body, wrapped in a white linen shroud, was lowered into the damp grave. Captain Nemo, arms crossed over his chest, and his men knelt in silent prayer. The grave was then filled with the excavated soil, forming a small mound. When this was done, Captain Nemo and his crew rose, then knelt again before the grave, their outstretched hands a final farewell. The funeral procession returned to the Nautilus, passing beneath the forest canopy. through thickets of kelp and coral still ascending. Finally, the ship's lights appeared, their luminous trail guiding us back. We arrived at 1 o'clock. After changing, I climbed to the deck, a maelstrom of emotions swirling within me. I sat down near the helm, where Captain Nemo soon joined me. "So, as you predicted," I said, "the man died during the night?" "Yes, Miss Aronnax. And he rests now alongside his companions in the coral cemetery." "Yes," Nemo replied, his voice heavy with grief. "Forgotten by the world, but not by us. We dug his grave, and the polyps will seal it for eternity." He quickly hid his face in his hands, unable to suppress a sob. Then he added, "Our peaceful cemetery lies 100 feet beneath the waves. At least your dead rest undisturbed, Captain, safe from sharks." "Yes, Professor," he replied solemnly, "from sharks and men."
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Quantum Dispatches, and stay tuned next week for another thrilling adventure. Thank you for listening.